All right, so the objectives of this class, we're going to analyze the causes and effects of the French Revolution. We're also going to look at the Haitian and some Latin American revolutions. And then we're going to kind of put those into context. I'm going to spend a lot of time in comparing and contrasting the French Revolution with the American Revolution because one did cause the other. And then we're going to look at the chaotic and violent natures of political revolutions. The French Revolution was extremely bloody. And then we're going to outline what makes a revolution a success or not. We're really going to be looking at the French Revolution for that because even French people don't think the revolution was completely successful. All right, so let's talk about the causes of the French Revolution. First and foremost, we've already established last week that the American Revolution was caused by the economic impact of the wars of empire. Britain was broke. Britain started taxing the American colonists. The American colonists says, we're not going to allow you to tax us anymore. They rebelled. They won their independence. American Revolution. France was on the losing side of those wars. So however bad the economy was for Great Britain, the economy of France was a lot worse. The wars of empire devastated the French economy. So France spent more time fighting in the continent than Britain did, which means France had to have bigger armies, more expenditure, more supplies. Fighting in the continent is extremely expensive, and Britain was able to fight on the cheap by fighting in the colonies. On top of that, France lost more colonial territory than Britain. Britain really didn't lose any colonial territory. They swapped one chain of islands for another, but they gained all control of Canada, they gained control of Louisiana, and they kicked the French completely out of India and Africa. On top of that, France's government was way more expensive than the British government. So in week 2, when we were talking about the Enlightenment, we talked about the English Civil War and then the Glorious Revolution. A couple of centuries, 100 or 200 years before the French Revolution broke out, England had already had severe limitations placed on their monarchies. So England's government was functioning through its parliament. The parliament representing the taxpayer of England. The government in England was generally a lot cheaper than that of the French government. The French government didn't have any of those obstacles. King Louis was able to spend whatever he wanted. So the French government was way more expensive than the British government. Don't forget, you're going to want to grab each of the 4 handouts. Oh, I took your seat. I'm so sorry. Now, to draw a connection between the American and the French Revolution. When the American Revolution began, the American colonists needed support, wanted support, but really needed it from one of the big dogs in Europe. And one of the big dogs that was really interested in getting involved in our revolution was France. France was looking for vengeance. France was looking for revenge, a way to save face, a way to reestablish its international prestige, especially after getting spanked by the British for the last 50 years. So when the American colonies began an open rebellion, they reached out to France, and France liked the idea of helping the colonies give Great Britain a bloody nose. I mean, just outlining the things that the French lost. The French lost the War of Spanish Succession. They lost the War of Austrian Succession. They lost the French and Indian War. They lost their colonies in India. They lost their colonies in Louisiana, and they lost their colonies in Canada.
Okay, so what did they win?
What did they win? A pat on the back and a job well done? I don't know. They didn't really win anything. So the American colonists reached out to France for assistance in the war. But France, while eager to get revenge on the British, didn't really see the American colonists as betting on a winning horse. Especially in 1776. I mean, the British were sending reinforcements into the colonies. The colonies didn't have a standing army, and they hadn't really won any significant victories. Yeah, they won the Battle of Bunker Hill and the battles of Lexington and Concord, but that's militia action on a small scale. The French looked at that and said, okay, what British armies have you effectively defeated? Yes?
Why were they losing so much if they invested so much?
Because when France was fighting wars like the Austrian Succession and Spanish Succession, they were trying to fight everywhere at the same time. So like, for example, France was tied up in defending their borders at home, because France is part of continental Europe, and fighting for their colonies. Britain was able to dedicate all of their military might against the colonies. So like the French and Indian War, for example, broke out in 1754. The first couple of years of the war, the French were winning. And by 1756-57, France could not send any more reinforcements to North America, but Britain can. So, an example being, and I'm going to connect this to New York history. I told you about the fort at the southern tip of Lake George, right? Talked about that last week. The French general that attacked that was a guy named General Montcalm. And Montcalm was probably one of the better generals that France had in its military at that point in time. And he was shot and mortally wounded outside of Montreal, the Battle of the Plains of Abraham. I think it was Montreal, it may have been Quebec, but it's the Battle of the Plains of Abraham. And when he found out that he was dying, he like flew into this tirade about how he had been abandoned by his government and that France didn't deserve to win and that he had, risked his life and sacrificed his life for nothing and that his men were cowards and that, the supplies were shit. Like he just basically went on a rampage. He's like, I'm gonna die anyway. What are they gonna do, execute me? And it just pretty much highlights the fact that he felt like he had been abandoned by his own government. Now, to his mind, he was. But to the French that were fighting the continent, they couldn't afford to send him any more men because they were fighting everybody else. So that's why France was able, lost so many or so much because they were ganged up on a lot. France had the biggest population in Europe, so whenever France was pulled into a war, everybody looked at France as target number one. Okay, so France wanted to make sure that the American colonies would at least be able to stand on their own before they started designating or dedicating large amounts of resources to fight for our revolution, because they didn't want to have to carry us across the finish line. In 1777, we showed them that we could stand on their own. Once again, we're going to connect this to New York history. How many of you have ever been to Saratoga, up in the north? Know where that is? Saratoga Springs, ever hear of that town?
Yes.
Okay, you've heard of Saratoga Springs? There's a battlefield out there. And in 1777, a British army of about 7,000 men was cut off by the Continental Army and destroyed. It's the turning point in the American Revolution. It's the Battle of Saratoga right here. It was the battle that the American colonists showed the French that we could beat the English. So the Saratoga campaign, just to put this in a little bit of a context, it was a two-pronged attack that was supposed to be focused against Philadelphia. So General Howe, who was in charge of British forces in New York City, was going to use New York as a base of operations to launch an attack on Pennsylvania, Philadelphia specifically, to try to capture the Continental Congress, cut off the snake's head, and end the rebellion by killing the leadership. And he sent a guy named General Burgoyne with 7,000 redcoats out to the interior part, Saratoga. He was going to march north, go to the interior, and then sweep down behind. The point was, or the plan was that Howe, with his 12,000 men, was going to be the main point of aggression, so that all the American Continental forces would focus on trying to stop Howe, and then Burgoyne would come in through the back door. Well, Howe ended up getting tied up in New Jersey with a woman. He was like, hey. So he caught the attention, or she caught his attention. It was some widow, some upper-class American widow. Rumors say that it was actually Betsy Ross. And she was working on behalf of Washington. He was like, hey, go sleep with General Howe, please. Get him to get sidetracked. Well, either way, Howe ended up stalling in New Jersey. Nobody really knows why. And Burgoyne was left with his ass hanging out in the middle of New York, where the Continental Army caught him at Saratoga, cut him off from reinforcements, and after a 2 or 3 day battle, defeated him. But it was the battle in 1777, and I want to point something out in this painting. So this is General Burgoyne offering his sword as surrender to the commander of the American Army, Horatio Gates. But this guy right here, that's a French advisor. So the French sent advisors to the colonies to kind of see if we were even worth it in the first place. The French did send some token, some little tokens in 1776. They sent us a little bit of money, some guns, some food, just kind of like, and a couple of advisors, just to see if we'd even be worth it. But they were looking for proof that they would not be left holding the bag in the event that the revolution failed. And in Saratoga, we proved that we could stand on our own. We followed that up with something called the Battle of Germantown, where a Continental Army attacked a British fixed fortification and destroyed it. And the French were, that also reassured the French. So Saratoga showed that the Continental Army would be willing and able to stand up to a British army in open field and defeat them. And then the Battle of Germantown showed the French that we would even take care of siege warfare as well. And that kind of convinced the French that maybe we had a chance. So they dedicated themselves to the cause. In 1778, France became the first country to recognize American independence. Spain became the second. When a country is fighting for independence, getting recognition from one of the big dogs is huge. Because once the big dogs recognizes the legitimacy of a tiny, budding country, that opens up all kinds of diplomatic avenues for other countries around the world to treat this new country as something that's legitimate. Like when ISIS, for example, proclaimed themselves to be a caliphate, they were the size of New Jersey. So they definitely had the landmass to be recognized as a country, and they had the population for it, but nobody recognized them as an independent and sovereign nation. Everybody in the world looked at them as a breakaway, insurgent, rebel state. And that's why they had no outside help. So when the United States declared its independence in 1776, for 2 years we had no backers. And then France threw their weight around and said, we recognize the United States. And that kind of opened the door for France to begin aiding us, trading with us, negotiating with us as an independent nation. And then Spain did the same thing. And then everybody recognized us as independent except Britain. So in 1778, after the French recognized American independence, they dedicated resources to the cause. They sent 10,000 men, a bunch of money, an entire fleet, all kinds of weaponry in order to support the Continental Army. Their base of operations, by the way, was in White Plains. So 20 miles north, that's where the French base of operations was. The 10,000 French soldiers that were sent to the colonies were put under the command of General Washington. The size of Washington's army doubled overnight. And he had the manpower needed to kick the British out of the colonies. One thing to keep in mind, though, with what the French dedicated to the American Revolution, they spent more money on our revolution than they did in the French and Indian War. So let's put that into context. When they were fighting to defend their own colonies in Canada versus when they were fighting to defend our independence, they spent more on us than they did on themselves.
Wow.
That's how desperate they were for revenge. 10,000 men was one thing. The fleet of ships was another really important thing, and also one of the biggest expenditures for the French military. Britain was the preeminent naval power in the world until after World War II. It was World War II where the United States finally overtook Britain as the most powerful naval power in the world. Britain is now number 2, but they were number 1 for hundreds of years. Anybody that knows anything about the tactical operations of the American Revolution knows that our independence was essentially won at the Battle of Yorktown. Does that ring a bell? Yorktown is a port city in Virginia. In 1781, as the war began winding down, there were only 2 field armies of the British Empire functioning within the colonies. There was General Howe, who was in New York, and he stayed there the whole war. And then there was General Cornwallis, who was fighting all through the South. And Cornwallis was supposed to link up with Howe to reinforce Howe's men, and then together as a combined force, they were going to push on Philadelphia again and try to end the revolution by once again capturing the Continental Congress. The Continental Army cut off Cornwallis and kind of drove him into the port city of Yorktown, where he fortified his position and waited for the British fleet to come pick him up. The fleet was supposed to come to Yorktown, pick up his troops, and ferry them all to New York, where the war would continue. The French beat the British fleet to it. And what happened with the Battle of Chesapeake was the British fleet tried to break through to Yorktown in order to get Cornwallis's men out of there, and the French fought them off. Without the French fleet at Chesapeake, Yorktown would not have been a successful victory for the colonists. And the war would have continued for another several years, possibly. Speaking of Yorktown, here's a painting of General Cornwallis' second-in-command surrendering to Washington at Yorktown. Cornwallis was absolutely embarrassed about being defeated by a bunch of colonial peasants that he refused to show up to surrender, so he sent his number 2 guy to do it. But one thing to point with the map, or with this painting, this is General Washington. Here's the American army. Here's the French army. The French were at Yorktown with us. Okay, so by the mid-1780s, I think we can safely establish that France's economy was completely in shambles. Yeah, they were on the winning side in the American Revolution. But do you think they won anything by helping us win our independence? They want a nice big fat IOU from the United States of America because we had no money either, so we couldn't pay them back. They didn't get any land, they didn't get any of their colonies back. Really, in the scheme of things, all they spent their money on was for the right to get vengeance. That was it. They didn't gain anything from helping us in our revolution.
So they still lost.
I guess you could say they did. They didn't lose, they just didn't win. So by the mid-1780s, France's economy was in ruins. 50% of all of the French's government expenditure was going to servicing their war debts. Just paying the interest. 50% of all government expenditure. I'm going to put this into context for here. Does anybody know what the national debt is for the United States?
I think it's 3 trillion.
Oh, I wish it was 3 trillion. 3 trillion would be easy. It just ticked over 22 trillion. Does anybody know how much the federal government spends every year? A little over $4 trillion. What we spend on servicing our debt, just paying the interest, is about $250 billion. So we only spend about 2 or 3% of the national budget on maintaining our debt. France's debt was so big, they had to spend 50% of their budget on servicing their debt. Right? Imagine being that broke. Another 25% of France's economy, or France's government expenditure, was going to maintaining the army. So their debt was twice as expensive as their army. And the other 25% was going to pay for everything else. All the infrastructure maintenance, paying the salaries of the nobility, everything was coming out of that final 25%. So their economy was in ruins. Now the king at the time was King Louis XVI. His grandfather was the one that fought the French in Indian War, Louis XV. And when Louis XV died of illness, Louis XVI, he was born Louis Capet, inherited the throne. He was like in his really early 20s, and he was scared to death of taking the throne. The night of his coronation, he supposedly said in prayer, "Help me, dear Lord, for I reign too young." And his wife was a couple years younger than he was. Marie Antoinette, by the way, of Austria. So Louis XVI was possibly the worst king for the time. I'm not saying that Louis XVI was bad. He was an idiot, but he wasn't cruel. France had its own share of cruel kings. But if Louis XVI had been born 100 years prior, he would have continued. He would have been a king his entire life. He was just a very bad crisis manager. The thing with Louis is he dithered about a lot, and he was very indecisive. So it was this game that the French ministers used to play during the reign of Louis, is they would gamble with each other, and whoever won these bets would become the last minister to propose their idea to King Louis, because Louis would always accept the idea of the last person he spoke to. So everybody he'd say, he's like, "Oh, that's a great idea, I'm going to implement it." And then the next person, "Oh, that's a great idea, I'm going to implement that." And he couldn't make any decisions. And the thing is, he knew it. So Louis' like, "Oh yeah, I'm done." So he began cycling through finance ministers to try to solve the financial crisis. But all of his finance ministers that he hired told him the exact same thing. "We can't balance the budget unless we raise taxes and cut government expenditure. That's it. Cut spending and raise taxes. It's the only way we're going to get ourselves out of it." And Louis would be like, "Thank you for your time. You're fired." And then the next minister would come in. I guess what Louis wanted was somebody that could cook the books or go out to the money tree and just start picking $100 bills off of it. One of the finance ministers that Louis hired was a guy named Jacques Necker. Jacques Necker would be considered a revolutionary because he came up to Louis and said, "Hey, you know what? Maybe we should start taxing the nobility." And Louis' like, "Oh, you're crazy." The French peasantry, suffering under the mercantile system, was taxed to the max, so they were no longer a good source of revenue. And the French aristocracy had been exempted from paying taxes for centuries. So you're going to come up to a group of people that hadn't paid taxes in centuries and be like, "Hey, you should start paying taxes." How do you think they're going to react to that? They're not going to react very well. On top of that, the royal courts continued to spend lavishly on parties and palaces. One of the revolutionaries, Maximilien Robespierre, wrote an open letter to the king that said, "You and your family consume in one day what the average citizen eats in a year."
Wow.
And that's because they have these enormous parties, and they just shovel food into their mouth. Really what had happened was the aristocracy was completely out of touch with the commoners. And there's a very good reason for that. How many of you know about the Versailles Palace? Some of you probably heard of it. If you ever go to France, this is one of the places you should probably go. It's a total tourist trap, but it's worth going to anyway. The Versailles Palace was built by Louis XIV, who started his rule in the tail end of the 1600s and ruled for like 60 or 70 years. The seat of power for the French monarchy was a palace in Paris called the Tuileries Palace. Louis XIV apparently didn't like looking out his window and seeing poor people. So he built Versailles at fantastic expense. And Versailles is located about 12 miles outside of Paris, although now since Paris has gotten so big, it's kind of like absorbed where Versailles was built. But Versailles was supposed to be 12 miles away from the city, so completely away from the riffraff and the commoners. And that also meant that the seat of government was moved away from Paris into this obscure rural area. So all of the ministers that worked in France or worked for the government lived in this palace, worked in that palace, and had no connection with the commoners. So don't you think that's going to leave them pretty out of touch? Washington, D.C. has the same problem. During the recession of 2008, Washington, D.C. was the only city in America that made money. Don't you think they might be a little out of touch? So, France had been organized into this old social order pretty much since the Middle Ages, called the Ancien Régime, which literally means the ancient order, or the ancient regime, or the old order. And it divided French citizens, or French people, into three very distinct classes. And you can see in the notes that you have in front of you. The first estate was dedicated to the clergy. They made up about 0.5% of the population. They had a fair bit of the wealth. They also owned, I want to say, between 15 and 20% of the land. So they had quite a bit of land. The second estate was the nobility, 1.5% of the population. They owned about 30 or 40% of the land. So they owned quite a bit of land. And then the third estate was everybody else. The third estate made up 98% of the entire French population. They only had access to about 35 to 40% of all the farmable land. Everything else is owned by the nobility or the clergy. Now you can kind of divide the third estate into two subclasses. You've got the urban and the rural. The rural were the farmers. These were the free farmers that owned their own plots, and the serfs that would work the land owned by the nobility. The urban third estate were folks like, the factory workers. Well, they didn't have factories at that time. I should say the dock workers, the blue-collar workers, the carpenters, that kind of thing. But you also had the merchant class that also was considered part of the third estate. In French, they're called the bourgeoisie. They are the middle class. They're the shopkeepers. There were some members of the bourgeoisie that were actually wealthier than members of the aristocracy. And it was not uncommon for members of the aristocracy to marry their kids off into bourgeoisie families and vice versa. Because the bourgeoisie had the money but no prestige, and some aristocrats would have all the prestige, but some aristocratic families would be dirt broke. So they would usually put together these marriages to where the family could have their finances rehabilitated by the bourgeoisie, and the bourgeois would get access to the prestige of the aristocracy. But in terms of taxation in France, the free farmers were the ones that were hit the hardest. I think we talked about the farming cycle last class. Did we not? Like the average life cycle of a farmer? No. Farmers go into debt during the wintertime, and they go into significant debt if they own big farms. Because, the only time a farmer is really producing anything is during the harvest. So the rest of the year, like in the spring you're sowing and you're planting, right? In the summer and fall you're harvesting. But in the winter, you're giving hay rides, you're chilling out. So a lot of farmers go into debt during the wintertime, and then when the harvest comes in, they sell their crop and then use the profits from selling their crops in order to pay off their debt and then pocket the rest. But taxes eat into those profits. So the farming class, especially the farmers that own their own land, were being devastated by these taxes. And if a farmer couldn't pay their taxes, they'd lose their farms. Now what happens if you have a country where you're taxing the hell out of your farmers and your farmers are no longer able to farm? Well, food. Yeah, no food. So starting in 1789, there was a food shortage, specifically around wheat. The staple food for the French diet is bread, or at least it was. It probably still is. And the average French citizen in the 1700s would eat 2 pounds of bread a day. Now imagine if there's a chronic wheat shortage, what that does to the price of bread. At the height of the food shortage, a loaf of bread would cost a month's wage. All right. So Louis did try to levy taxes against the nobility, but he was blocked by the nobility. Now Louis technically did have the power, because he was an absolute monarch, to push this reform through, but ultimately the nobility were the ones that were in charge of tax collection. So even if Louis was saying, you're going to pay these taxes and you're going to like it, the nobles could throw a penny in his direction and say, that's all we could collect. So France began suffering food shortages starting in 1784, but by 1789 it was a full-blown famine. From a combination of the crippled economy, rampant inflation within the French economy, the farmers were losing their land and it was getting progressively worse every year. And on top of that, in the 50 years before the French Revolution broke out, there was a population surge in France. Because the way, this is going to sound so jacked up, but the way the European population was controlled in the 1600s was plague. So if the population started growing too much, a plague would break out, kill off the excess population, and then things would continue on.
Wow.
So what controlled the population growth in Europe and prevented food shortages in the 16 and 1700s was the outbreak of plague. Well, in the 1700s, the plague went away because treatments were found and sanitation was improved. So now you've got a population surge. 50 years before the French Revolution broke out, France's population grew by 1 million people, and the farmers couldn't keep up. So, some of you are already seeing that this is a fat mess. Yes?
Isn't that what they're, like, there's a conspiracy going around as to why, like, measles and all these things, that's what the government is doing to try to, like, shorten population?
Yeah, but, I mean, germ theory wasn't even a thing. So I seriously doubt King Louis XV is like, oh, we need to break out of smallpox to kill off the excess population. It was because of bad sanitation that these plagues would break out. Because there's lack of, no germ theory and almost no medical technology, when the plague would break out, it would just rip through an area uncontrolled and then eventually burn itself out.
So the plague was just a coincidence that it happened during that period?
Correct.
Not that they...
Because of low sanitation.
I was like,
That's what I was.
yeah, I was like, how was it at that exact time?
No, I mean, even the outbreak of the Black Death, which killed over almost half of Europe's population in the 1300s, was an accident. So, and it was facilitated by superstition, because the Black Death in the 1300s was spread by fleas, and fleas ride on the back of rats, and cats eat rats. But when the plague broke out, everybody thought witchcraft was the cause of it, so they started slaughtering the cats. Killed off the cats, no cats to eat the rats, more rats, they'd populate, fleas would populate, jump on humans, more plague. What actually stopped the plague dead in its tracks in London is half the city burned down.
Wow.
Somebody knocked over a lantern and caught a barn on fire, and it just jumped from building to building to building. And when the fire finally burned down, about half of the city had been burned down, but it killed all the rats, and the plague ended. So. I know, right? Funny how that works out. Okay, so yeah, the food shortages became a full-blown famine by 1789. In response to the food shortage and the crisis that France was facing, Louis finally gave in to external pressures and called for a general assembly. It was called the Estates General. All of the three estates were to meet at Versailles in order to discuss reform. Just to put this into context, this Estates General was called in 1789. The last time an Estates General was called, 1614. So it had been 175 years since the previous Estates General was called. Here's a painting of the Estates General. King Louis is up here on his throne, and then you've got all of the delegates. Now, there were about 1,200 people that participated in the Estates General, and all of them were divided among the estates. Estates 1 and 2 had about 300 delegates, which means the third estate was represented by about 900 delegates. Now, you would think, through a democratic process, that each delegate would get a vote, and that the third estate would be able to carry the day and dominate the Estates General, but that wasn't the case. French tradition with the Estates General says that each estate gets one collective vote. So it doesn't matter if you have 1,000 delegates or 2 delegates, you still get 1 vote per estate. And there are 3 estates. And the first 2 estates are the ones that are in privilege, and the 3rd estate isn't.
Wow.
So the 3rd estate began proposing all of these different reforms that probably would have solved the problem, or at least reduced the suffering. You know, tax increases on the nobility, a transparent tax system, legal reforms, limitations on the power of the monarchy, that kind of thing. And every time they would propose one of these things, the 1st and 2nd estate would vote it down. They even tried to reform the internal functioning of the Estates General. The 3rd estate wanted to propose a reform to the delegation itself, saying each delegate should get 1 vote. Once again, they were blocked by the 1st and 2nd estate, who knew that if that went through, they would lose their monopoly on power of the Estates General. So you had an impasse. So the 3rd estate would be like, we should raise taxes on the nobility. And the 1st and 2nd estate, because their interests were combined, would stand up and say, nope, we vote that down. Oh, okay, who's going to pay the taxes? And the 1st and 2nd estate would stand up, point at the 3rd estate, and say, they will. Yes?
So the 3rd estate was 4?
3rd estate ran a whole gamut. You did have members of the 3rd estate, but a lot of them were peasants. So after a couple of weeks of this nonsense, on June 17th of 1789, the 3rd estate decided, you know what, they'd had enough. And they stormed out of the palace. And they seceded. They're like, we're done. And they ended up joining up with a couple of members of the 1st estate, lower clergy, so like priests and monks, people that are on the ground, that are actually able to see what's happening to the peasantry. And these folks got together and they declared themselves a new legislative body. They called themselves the National Assembly. They had no legal right to exist whatsoever. The king never signed off on it. It was a completely illegal legislative body. But they're like, nothing's going through with the Estates General, so we're going to be the new Congress of the French people. Pretty gutsy. 3 days later, on June 20th of 1789, the National Assembly, which planned to return to the Estates General and proclaim that they were the National Assembly and that they were essentially taking over legislative duties of the French government, they arrived at the Palace of Versailles and found all of the doors were locked and under armed guard, which means they were probably thinking, oh, the troops are on their way. So they all gathered into a tennis court, although we would now call it a handball court. Tennis has gone through quite a bit of changes in the last 200 years. And they took comfort, or they took refuge in this tennis court, and essentially swore an oath to each other that they would, by hook or by crook, they would continue to meet until they had written a constitution for France and reformed the French government. It's called the tennis court oath. They swore that they would do whatever was necessary to construct a constitution for France. Out of the 577 members that were in the tennis court, 576 took the oath. The one person who did not take the oath was a royalist that thought that he couldn't really make a decision without the king giving his approval. So, what do we got so far? The Estates General has fallen flat on its face. Food shortages are getting pretty bad. Food shortages are, by the way, are turning into riots. By 1789, there were bread riots happening in Paris. So, put yourself in the position of a Parisian baker. Right? Your job is to bake bread. Wheat's probably pretty expensive for you, right?
What is?
Wheat. Because there's a wheat shortage. So you're probably paying through the nose in order to get wheat in order to bake your bread. So that also means that your bread prices are astronomically high, right? What was happening in Paris is the mob was breaking into baker shops and killing the bakers. Accusing them of price gouging, accusing them of hoarding bread, and they were lynching people. Yep. Economics 101, sometimes the mob just doesn't understand economics. All they really had, I bet you any baker was like, hey, but you know, supply and demand, and then, I mean, come on, you're going to give a lesson on supply and demand to an angry mob that's ready to lynch you?
Like, take it for free.
I know, right? It was bad. So it got to the point where the French government needed to send in troops because the local constabulary could not maintain control in Paris. So Louis started calling up troops. But to coincide with these bread riots, you've got the proclamation of the National Assembly, which is not a legitimate legislative body. So the National Assembly is like, we're here, we're going to fix France. And all of a sudden they're like, why are there so many soldiers gathering outside of Paris? So the natural conclusion was that Louis had called in the troops to put down the National Assembly. That actually wasn't the case. I think Louis was curious. I think he was secretly thinking, I wonder what's going to happen with these. The troops were called in to suppress the bread riots. But that didn't matter to the people of Paris, because once again, one, there's no Twitter, and two, it's not like the king can get on a loudspeaker, my fellow Parisians. It's not like he could do that. So they just see troops amassing outside of Paris. So the people of Paris freak out. They're like, the troops are coming, they're going to put down our guys in the National Assembly, the revolution is going to die before it even begins. So how are they going to defend the National Assembly?
They attack.
They kind of did. Well, you're cheating. You're looking at it. The Parisian mob began breaking into armories all throughout the city, stealing guns, cannons, ammunition. Now, someone in the French military was smart enough to have all of the gunpowder relocated to a central location that was far more secure than the city armories. They put them in an old medieval fortress called the Bastille. So the Parisian mob broke into the armories, got guns, cannons, ammunition, but no gunpowder, which means it's practically useless. So they then attacked the Bastille in order to get access to the gunpowder. Now the Bastille was also a symbol for the people of Paris as well, because the Bastille, was the headquarters of the Parisian Inquisition during all the religious holy wars. So the Inquisition operated at the Bastille. It had a reputation for being a house of horrors. People would be taken into the Bastille in the 1600s and tortured to death. They'd just disappear. I mean, awful ways of torture. We're talking cutting, burning, drowning, anything you can imagine. It all happened in the Bastille. And it was a prison for a time. And during the storming of the Bastille in 1789, it was still used as a political prison. There were 6 people imprisoned in the Bastille, all political opponents to the king, but it was used mostly as a warehouse for the French army. So the Parisian mob attacked the Bastille and in order to get access to the gunpowder. There was a short battle outside the Bastille, but it was fierce, as the garrison of the Bastille did try to defend themselves and hold their positions, but the garrison was not equipped for a prolonged siege, and the commander of the garrison did not want unnecessary bloodshed on his hands, because all he saw when his troops were opening fire into the crowd was that he was killing other French citizens, and he didn't want to kill his neighbors. So he ordered the garrison to cease fire, put down their weapons, and to open the gates. What happened next is something he probably regretted for the rest of his life, because the Parisian mob broke in, killed the garrison, chopped their heads off, stuck their heads on pikes, and began parading them through the streets of Paris.
Savage.
The guy who even ordered the garrison to stop fighting, he was beaten so badly that he screamed out, "For the love of God, just kill me."
Wow.
All right. So now you've got blood on the streets. You've got violence going on. Louis has clearly lost control of his country. So Louis then went to Paris. He got the military to back off, and then he went to Paris, met with a couple of members of the National Assembly, tried to smooth things over. He took this little cockade. I'm actually going to show you a picture. This is a cockade. It's kind of like this red, white, and blue tricolor. Put it on his hat. Everybody's like, yeah, the king's with us. It's a show of solidarity. Louis's like, please don't kill me. But Louis then granted some privileges and power to the National Assembly. He did give the National Assembly the power to abolish the feudal rights of the nobility, which meant all of the historical exemptions for taxation for the nobility were taken away by the National Assembly. And with Louis' decision, I look at this as one of two ways. Either one, he was finally reaching his breaking point and tired of the political deadlock and wanting to do something. Or two, he was afraid that if he didn't give the National Assembly some power, they were going to take it. Yep. So either way, in August of 1789, the National Assembly then gathered together and wrote the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, which is kind of like the French version of the Declaration of Independence, except instead of declaring independence as a new country, they are declaring their intentions of creating a new government and restructuring France from the top down. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen proclaims equality of all men, embraces the concept of popular sovereignty, Popular sovereignty is the belief that that government gets its power from the consent of the governed, and that as soon as the governed do not consent, then they can take their power away from the government. And the Declaration asserted individual rights to liberty, property, and security. So King Louis was also then granted the power to veto legislation, and by August of 1789, it looked as if the French were on the path to creating a constitutional monarchy, much in the same format as the British government. However, that did not stop the violence. The nobles, having had a lot of their privileges taken away, retreated. They're like, you know what, we're going to lay low. And they went out into their countryside chateaus, or they went on vacation to other parts of the world, and they just kind of disappeared. But then rumors began circling around the mob that what the nobles were doing was that they were actually secretly retreating into their chateaus to hire mercenaries and bandits to terrorize the common people. None of this was true. It was a rumor, and it's called the Great Fear because the peasantry was terrified that the nobility were there to kill them, brutalize them, oppress them, to reassert noble rule. So what the peasantry did is they armed themselves with whatever they could, axes, pitchforks, firearms if they had them, and they went out into the countryside and began attacking nobles in their chateaus. Burning their chateaus, murdering the nobles that were hunkering inside, sometimes killing their families. Hundreds, if not thousands of people were murdered, all because of a rumor. Many nobles that did escape the violence fled the country. They packed whatever they could and they got out of Dodge. And they took their tax revenue with them. Things got worse in October. On October 1st of 1789, King Louis had hosted a banquet for his royal bodyguard, the Swiss Guard, the personal bodyguards of the House of Bourbon. There was one thing I completely forgot to tell you. So remember I showed you this picture of the cockade, right? How it's got blue in the center, and then white, and then red. Red and blue are the colors of Paris, and then white is the color of the House of Bourbon, which is the monarchy. So that's why the French flag is the blue bar, the white bar, and the red bar. Because it's a representation of the revolution, that Paris was being divided by the king.
What was the white again? The white?
White represents the House of Bourbon. And yes, bourbon is spelled just like the drink. It's called the tricolor, the tricolor in French. The monarchs of France were protected by I don't know if you would call them mercenaries. I'm drawing a blank on what you would call them, but they were kind of like a private security firm. They were called the Swiss Guard. They'd be trained in Switzerland. So they did speak French. And their contract was paid by the monarchs. And they were very, very good. The Swiss Guard would hire soldiers from all around the world in order to serve in the Swiss Guard. And they were paid very well, and they were considered excellent soldiers. So the Swiss Guard would have these annual banquets with the monarch. And usually it was more so for the Swiss Guard. Meet in the palace, have a big banquet, bring their families, have fun, that kind of thing. And the banquet was coming due in October of 1789, and Louis decided to not cancel the banquet so that he could show at least some semblance of normalcy for his guards. Once again, the rumor mill began to swirl. Now, in reality, Louis showed up to the banquet. He was there for like maybe half an hour, had a couple of drinks, made a few toasts, and then booked it. Went back to his family. The tradition of the Swiss Guard meant that all of the soldiers would be wearing their white uniforms to symbolize their solidarity with the House of Bourbon, and then all of the flags inside the banquet hall would be the royal flags of the royal government, which were the white field with the gold fleur-de-lis. However, a rumor began circling that somehow there was a tricolor in the room, and that the Swiss Guard pulled the tricolor down, threw it on the ground, and began trampling on it. And then the rumor began going on that Louis also began trampling on this. None of this was true. Tricolor was not in that room. Swiss Guards were adhering to the tradition, and a tricolor would not be part of the traditional fanfare. But that didn't matter, and that pissed off a lot of people of Paris. So, a group of angry women, which in the slang of the day, they were called the poissards, the fish ladies. They were called the fish ladies because these are the working class women. A lot of them did work in fish markets, and they would carry these gigantic crates of fish. They were big and burly, really muscular women. They gathered whatever weapons they could, about 7,000 of them total, and they marched on Versailles.
And you said middle class?
Hmm?
You said what class were they?
Working class women. They broke into the Versailles Palace, they killed some of the guards, and then they went on a rampage in the palace. They worked themselves into a huge lather and they began running through the palace screaming out to kill Marie Antoinette. And they're like, they were shouting to each other what they were going to do to her. Oh, I'm going to slit her throat, I'm going to rip her guts out. And then they started arguing over what parts of their body they wanted her. I want a leg, I want her hand, I want her hair, and that kind of thing. They worked themselves into a frenzy. They actually did make it into Marie Antoinette's bedroom, and they were so angry, they had worked themselves into such a big frenzy, that they cut her bed apart. How angry you gotta be, you gotta chop up a bed.
She wasn't there.
She wasn't there. She's like, oh shit, she's out the door. She ended up running into her husband's room, and when the ladies made it into King Louis's room, he was there. He was like basically in his night garments. And he busted in, Marie Antoinette's hiding behind him. And he's like, hey ladies, how you doing? Some of you are probably wondering, why did they hate Marie Antoinette so much? So I think this is a good segue for me to tell you what Marie Antoinette's opinion in French society was. Marie Antoinette was pretty much doomed from the time she married Louis, mostly because she was Austrian. France and Austria historically had had a huge rivalry. Big rivalry, back from the Middle Ages. But in the 1700s, Austria and France, their national goals seemed more aligned with each other. So these historical rivals became allies in the 1700s. Specifically under the rule of Empress Maria Theresa. Now we talked about the War of Austrian Succession. Maria Theresa was the empress that took the throne after that war. That war was started because she ascended the throne of the Austrian government. Her father died, and she was the heir, and everybody in Europe was like, you can't let a woman inherit. That's bullshit. And France came to their aid. So in order to solidify this new alliance between France and Austria, Maria Theresa agreed to marry her daughter, Marie Antoinette, to the heir to the French throne, Louis Capet. She came to Paris when she was 14, Louis was 17. That's when they got married. Now Marie Antoinette was, raised as a spoiled rich kid. She was a wallflower. She really liked getting involved in fashion. She liked making herself look pretty. She liked being a socialite, really. That was her thing. But when she stepped into the role of Queen of France, especially after Louis XV died and Louis XVI was coronated when he was in his 20s, Marie Antoinette suddenly became the Queen of France instead of just this Austrian wallflower that is hanging out as a consort to the king. So her job as the Queen of France was to produce an heir to solidify the line of Bourbon. Because France has had its fair share of succession crises, so it was looked at as the job of the Queen to produce children, to secure the line of succession for the king so that the next generation doesn't have to worry about a succession crisis. And Marie Antoinette was anxious to do her job. She was a good-looking girl. And her job, my job is to get pregnant, and she was going to do whatever she could to do it. It took Louis 7 years to work up enough courage to have sex with his new wife.
What? How long?
7 years.
Wow.
They did not consummate the marriage until they were well into their 20s. She did not start having kids until she was in her 30s. There were a lot of rumors circling as to why. One of the rumors was that Louis had no sexual appetite whatsoever. And it's no surprise that during the early years of the marriage, Marie did not get pregnant and Louis got fat. Because he was more enamored with food than he was enamored with her. Marie Antoinette used to write letters to her mother. Mom, I don't know what's going on. I'm trying everything I can. Am I ugly? What's wrong with me? And Marie Theresa would write back, what are you talking about? You're the prettiest daughter I have. Everybody says you're gorgeous. Are you sure Louis not gay? Turns out Louis had a deformity that required surgery. I'm not going to go too far into the nitty-gritty, but he basically needed a circumcision. But this is the 1700s. There's no painkillers. There's no sanitation. You're gonna tell any dude in his 20s that he's gonna get circumcised? You'd be like, I want drugs. Give me drugs. It's the only way you can do it. So it took him years to work up the courage to get the procedure done. And what finally convinced him to get the procedure done is rumors were circling that he was actually gay. And he's like, oh shit, I can't have this. But as soon as he had the procedure done, she was pregnant. So, but I mean, it was a point of ridicule for everybody. And I'm talking all kinds of classes, not just the upper class, but the commoners as well. Louis XVI was an amateur locksmith, and he liked to work with clocks. So he'd like to work with clocks, and he liked working with watches. It was just something that he did. And people would sing songs, something akin to like, the locksmith was having trouble finding the keyhole. And Marie Antoinette was accused of, through these pornographic pamphlets that were distributed throughout the country called libelle. She was accused of having sex with everybody but her husband. So to the commoners of France, even after she started having kids, she was the Austrian whore. Now, because Marie Antoinette spent all of those years just not being able to do her job of having kids and raising her kids, she spent her time doing other things, and she got very good at spending money. Now, she was born a spoiled rich kid. She's living in Versailles. We've already established that the entirety of the aristocracy was out of touch with what was really happening in France. So nobody probably even told her that she shouldn't spend their money, and even if they thought that she shouldn't spend that kind of money, they kept their mouth shut. So Marie Antoinette got heavily involved into fashion. She used to throw these lavish parties with her friends. She did these ridiculous hairstyles. There was one hairstyle, she had her hair braided into a bird cage and then had birds put in her hair. There was another one, she had like her hair woven into like a table, and then there'd be like little fruits and baskets and food stuck in her hair, that kind of thing. And she earned this reputation for spending money so recklessly that the commoners of France began calling her Madame Deficit. So flash forward to the Possard running through Versailles. Food shortages, money's going out. Now you've seen Louis. Louis has showed up in Paris, and for everybody in the commoners' sake, Louis seems to be on their side. You break into Versailles Palace, let's get that bitch Marie Antoinette. She became the target of their rage. And really, she hadn't done anything wrong aside from spending money she didn't have. But show me any leader of state that doesn't do that. Okay. So the Possard broke into the Versailles Palace, killed a bunch of the guards, chopped their heads off, put them on pikes. Oh, and then when they broke into Marie Antoinette's room, they got her makeup stash and then started painting up the faces of the guards they had killed.
What?
And then when they found the royal family, they're like, you need to come back to Paris with us as a show of solidarity. They then emptied the palace larders of all the food, all the wheat, all the sugar, anything that was there, put them into carts, and then they had this gigantic procession, kind of like this parade back into Paris. And you can kind of put yourself into the position of the royal family, because the royal family, Louis, Marie, their kids, were all shoved into a carriage, and then the carriage was driving back to Paris, and in the front of the carriage was a couple of the Swiss Guard, obviously marching in formation. Behind the carriage was a couple of the Swiss Guard marching in formation, and on opposite sides of them were the Possard. And then lining the row next to the carriage were more of the Possard holding the pikes with the severed heads of the Swiss Guard. So if you're Louis or Marie Antoinette or any one of their kids, you look out the carriage window and you're going to see the severed head of one of your guards.
Wow.
With Marie Antoinette's makeup on, by the way. Because, they're classy. Louis was welcomed back into Paris as a hero, but then very quickly shuffled into the Tuileries Palace and placed under house arrest. And with this, the food shortages got worse. There were more lynchings, there were more riots, and the National Assembly was having a hell of a hard time maintaining control. The National Guard, the French National Guard, which was a militia put together by the revolutionaries, had to impose martial law in Paris. Church land and wealth was then seized in order to provide the government with much needed funds, which means a lot of Catholic monasteries got plundered by troops in order to bring money into the treasuries. Church officials were made employees of the state. In June of 1790, delegates from England, Prussia, Austria, and the Netherlands met in secret in order to discuss a possible military intervention in France. These are rivals with France, and they're looking at what's going on in France, and they're like, the king's in trouble.
We need to do something.
Exactly. By December of 1790, Louis ended up secretly sending a letter to the King of Prussia asking for military assistance. And that's big, because France at least was able to smooth things over with their relationship with Austria. But France and Prussia, they were enemies to the bitter end. Prussia became Germany. Germany invaded France twice in the 20th century. That should tell you all you know about the relationship between France and Prussia. They don't get along very well. And Louis was asking the King of Prussia for help. Now, because of the violence, because of the chaos that was going on within the streets of Paris, the National Assembly ended up breaking into two factions. One of the factions were moderates, and they began pushing for a constitutional monarchy. The other faction were radicals, members of what's called the Jacobin Club. The Jacobin Club were fierce anti-monarchists. They were the real hardcore radical revolutionaries. They wanted a total abolition of the monarchy and a top-to-bottom overhaul of French society. Just basically tear the whole thing down and rebuild it. The Jacobins were also big fans of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And Jean-Jacques Rousseau, remember we talked about purge society of evil, and what will be left is utopia. And that's what the Jacobins believed. So Jacobins, a lot of them took the mentality of we just need to kill all the bad people. So they became very violent. Jacobins were openly hostile to the church and the former nobility. Now Louis did himself no favors under house arrest. Because in June of 1791, Louis and his wife tried to sneak out of the palace disguised as commoners and escape the country. They were trying to go to Austrian-held part of the Netherlands. Obviously Austria, Marie Antoinette's from Austria, use her family ties in order to protect the French royal family. There are a couple of reasons. Some of them are more of urban legends, and some of them are more excuses as to why they didn't escape. They were caught 10 miles away from the border, so they were almost there. One of the urban legends that I'm particularly fond of was that the moment they were supposed to leave, Marie Antoinette decided to go back into her room and pack up more of her clothes.
Oh Lord, really?
I actually doubt that happened. I don't believe that. I wouldn't be surprised if it did happen. I mean, I'm not putting it beyond her. But I think Marie Antoinette saw the writing on the wall, and she was at least smart enough to know, we gotta get the fuck out of here. What did finally doom Louis is when the carriage was stopped at a checkpoint, the guy that checked their papers recognized the king because the king's face was stamped onto every coin in circulation in France. So,
He snitched? He snitched?
Of course he snitched.
They're here.
And they're here. So he stops the carriage, he's checking their papers. It's like, you look like Louis XVI. No, I'm Louis the Sixth. Pulls out a coin. I don't know, man, that looks like you. Busted. Taken back to Paris under armed guard. Now the National Assembly had a hot mess on its hands because, first off, the National Assembly is struggling to maintain control. But now they've got their monarch that's just been caught 10 miles away from the border of the enemy with his Austrian whore of a wife. Right? How do you think that's going to make the government look? They had one job, keep Louis in Paris, and they couldn't even do that. Like, you got one job. So the National Assembly had a crisis on their hands. In an attempt to keep constitutional negotiations on track, the National Assembly publicly proclaimed that they do not doubt Louis' loyalty and that he was taken out of Paris against his will. Oh, Louis is still on our side, guys. Someone kidnapped him. This is an Austrian plot because of his bitch wife. He's really loyal to us. But in secret, they're like, Louis, what the fuck, man? So the power of the king was formally stripped, and Louis was declared immune to prosecution, but then put under lock and key. In September of 1791, Louis was ratified a new constitution of France. He did that under the threat of death. And then in December of 1791, Louis sent another letter to the King of Prussia, begging him for military aid. Essentially saying, I have lost total control of my country. I'm under arrest, they're abusing me, the only way I can get control of the situation is with your troops. The National Assembly then declared that all living people, or all people living in France, regardless of color, were free. And then, but then, on top of that, reaffirmed slavery in the colonies.
That makes sense.
I know, right? You are all free, except you. And this is what contributed to the Haitian Revolution. Because in Haiti, I mean, the slaves are obviously hearing some things about this, because it's the talk of the town. And the slaves are thinking, okay, maybe this National Assembly is finally going to end slavery. And then the National Assembly says, yeah, everybody in France is free, except the Haitians. And the Haitians are like, so on October 1st of 1791, the National Assembly reconvened under the new constitution as the Legislative Assembly. In February of 1792, Prussia and Austria formed an alliance with the intention of moving troops into France and restoring Louis to the throne. In April of 1792, France, knowing full well what Austria and Prussia were doing, declared war against Austria and Prussia as a preemptive measure. France was in no condition to go to war. In January of 1793, France then declared war against all the other European countries that had not yet taken a side. So France declared war against Spain, Portugal, the Netherlands, and Great Britain. It was France, literally, versus the world. And obviously, as you can imagine, the French economy's in shambles, food shortages are aplenty, the nobility had left, many of them had military pedigrees, the French army was in no condition to fight. So they started losing battles, and they started losing a lot of them. After a very strong Austrian offensive, the Jacobins threatened to overthrow the convention by force unless the king was removed from power. Let's talk about the sans-culottes. These are the folks that were really the backbone of the revolution. Now, some of you are like, well, what is culotte? Sans-culotte means without breeches. There was an article of clothing within French society called culotte. They were basically knee pants, which means they would be pants, but they would end at your knees. And then you would wear like knee-high socks in order to cover the lower part of your legs. And then in French society, you would wear high heels. All right. Hey, that was the fashion of the day. What was that?
High heels with socks?
Yep, high heels with socks.
Those look like...
Hey, you got to show off your calves somehow.
Were these human? Those days, were they?
And they wore wigs. And they were dudes.
Those are those shoes that look like little leprechaun shoes?
Yes, with the buckles on the front. Yeah, that was the fashion of the day. And then they would wear wigs. I'm not making this up. I know, I look at like portraits of the day and I'm like, oh, thank God I was born in the 20th century. So wearing the culotte, the knee pants, was considered like a status of wealth, really. Because the aristocracy all wore them. And they were kind of expensive because they were designer pants. The working class folks would wear trousers, like what we have. And if you wore trousers, you were considered common. And there were members of the bourgeoisie that could have afforded the culotte. But part of the revolutionary fervor, they started wearing trousers. The sans-culotte, the without knee pants. These guys came from all walks of life. Many of them were members of the bourgeoisie, so they were the middle classes, but there were quite a few poor ones involved as well. But they also were the backbone of Jacobin support as well. Because the bourgeoisie, remember, these are the guys that had all the wealth but none of the prestige. And they wanted the prestige and they wanted some of the political power. And the Jacobins come in and say, hey, put us in power, we're going to kill all the nobles. And the bourgeoisie were like, I like that idea. So they backed the Jacobins. They also advocated the abolition of the monarchy, social equality, popular democracy, and national price control, because they wanted the French government to respond to the food crisis by installing price controls, which, by the way, don't work. Just throwing that out there. Price controls are a disaster. And they also carried out much of the killings of the enemies of the revolution. So let's talk about some of these killings of the revolution. The September massacres, September 2nd to September 7th. Of 1792. We've established that when the war broke out, France was in really bad shape. And Prussia ended up taking the French city of Verdun. Verdun is an incredibly important citadel on the eastern frontier of France. It controls the main route into Paris. And they considered that city to be integral to the protection of Paris and to the country as a whole. Verdun saw some of the most savage fighting in World War I because the Germans tried to take the city. That's how eager the French are, that's how determined the French are to defend Verdun. Because if Verdun falls, Paris is threatened. And if you get Paris, you get the country. So Verdun was taken by the Prussians, and that sent a panic throughout France. Oh my God, the door to France, or the door to Paris is open. So the Parisians came to believe that the revolution was being undermined by traitors and royalists. So they attacked city prisons, which at this point in time were chock full of people who were caught up on the wrong side of the revolution and put in prison for it, and then began killing them. These are called enemies of the revolution. Most of these folks did absolutely nothing wrong except support the king. They were still loyal French citizens. They just wanted to see Louis on the throne because they were more traditional. And I'm not talking about these killings were clean. None of these folks got trials. The trials were makeshift. Think about, what was it, the third Batman movie. Have any of you seen that one with Bane? It's like, your guilt has already been established. This trial is to determine your fate. Death or exile. We choose exile. Okay, exile by death. Or whatever. That's basically what was happening with the September massacres. It's like, you've been accused of being a enemy to the revolution. How do you plead? I'm not an enemy to the revolution. You're already guilty anyway. So, choose your punishment. We can either kill you or we can kill you. It's quite literally what it was. And these were not quick killings either. It's not like these people were hanged or sent to the guillotine. Most of them were shot. Many of them were beaten to death. Some of them were burned to death. Some of them were cut up. All kinds of just brutal mob violence. No rhyme or reason. An estimated 1,400 people were killed, including women. One of them was the Princess de Lambaye, who was a friend of Marie Antoinette. That's why they killed her, by the way, is because she was connected to Marie Antoinette. Now, the September massacres were pushed by this guy, Jean-Paul Marat. And out of all the historical figures that I think of, Marat is one of the angriest. This guy hated life. Not entirely sure about his early life, but something happened to him when he was young and he ended up having to live in the sewers of Paris in order to get a roof over his head. And while he was there, he contracted some kind of awful skin condition that was a combination of itched and burned. I'm thinking it was something like psoriasis, but I honestly don't know. But it was really bad, and it was all over his body. And the only way that he would get relief is he would spend time in a medicinal bath, which was bath water with like some milk and herbs and rose petals and a couple chemicals and that kind of thing. It was the only way to get the itching and the pain and the burning to stop. And his skin condition was so bad that sometimes he would spend upwards of 20 hours in the bathtub. It was really, really bad. But he also published a newspaper called Friend of the People, L'Ami du Peuple. And he was the one that called for the September massacres. This guy, he didn't care about due process. All he cared about was if somebody was accused of being against the revolution, that somebody had to die. That was it. So people used to send him lists. Be like, my friend Joe said something bad about the Jacobins, or my friend Betty said something positive toward the king, and then he would publish those names and say these people need to be killed. So he would frequently publish names of so-called enemies of the revolution in order to alert the sans-culottes to either force them into exile or kill them. He used to be considered moderate, I guess you could say, in that when he first started publishing things, he's like, well, these are the top 100 people that are enemies of the revolution. If we kill them, the revolution will be successful. And he went from demanding the deaths of 100 people to demanding the deaths of 100,000. Like, his list just got longer and longer and longer. He kept an open door policy. He's like, my door is always open to the friend of the people. And people would come in and sit in a chair next to his bath and just list off names of people that needed to be killed. Now, don't you think if you have no scruples, you might go into Jean-Paul Marat to settle some personal grudges?
Of course.
Like, this bitch owes me money. Right?
She took my man.
She took my man, oh my god. Jean-Paul Marat ended up being murdered on July 13th of 1793 by a woman named Charlotte Corday. Charlotte Corday was a member of a royalist family from the city of Caen, in the northern part of France. Her brother, I believe, was in the military. Her father was a former soldier, definitely, possibly a former minister, low-level minister, but they were all royalists. And she had a couple of her friends actually get caught up and killed by Marat. So she went into Marat knowing about his open door policy and essentially told the guy that was watching the door, I have a list of enemies of the revolution. And Marat called her in. And she says, you know, I have a list of all these people that are speaking out against the revolution and are working to restore Louis to the throne. He's like, oh, we'll give you the list and I guarantee you they will die tomorrow. And she pulled out a knife and shanked the shit out of him. And then offered no resistance when she was arrested. She just stabbed him in the heart and then just kind of dropped the knife, walked out and be like, hi everybody, I just killed Marat. Fearless. And she was put on trial, and obviously during the trial the question asked, why did you kill Marat? And her answer was, I killed one man to save 100,000. She wanted the bloodshed to end. And they sent her off to the guillotine. The guillotine is a mechanical device with a gigantic blade that chops your head off. It was invented by a doctor. Yep, Dr. Guillotin. Yep. It killed so many people it earned the nickname the National Razor. However, after Marat was killed, he was turned into a martyr. A martyr of the revolution. And in response to his death, the Jacobins consolidated power within the convention and began cracking down on those who did not support him. And I'm throwing this painting up for a reason. There's a very famous Renaissance art piece called La Pieta. Has anybody ever heard of it?
Yeah.
There's a marble version of it done by Raphael, but it's a depiction of Christ being removed from the cross and being cradled by the Mother Mary. Most depictions of the Pieta have Jesus' body in the same kind of pose. He's slumped over, his right arm is hanging loosely, and he's being cradled by Mary. The painter of this tried to make this look like La Pieta, because people knew art, because there's no television back in the day. So somebody would see the painting of Marat's body in his bath and be able to draw parallels to La Pieta. People began praying to Marat. So people would say their prayers and then end their prayers, through the grace of Jesus, through the grace of Mary, through the grace of Marat. Right? In August of 1792, the Tuileries Palace was stormed by the Sans-Culottes, and all of the Swiss guards, about 800 men, were massacred. Those who survived the storming of the palace were sent off to the guillotine. So all of the Swiss Guard were essentially exterminated. Louis took shelter in the Legislative Assembly. The Assembly ordered the election of a new government. The convention formed, which we talked about, and was dominated by the Jacobins. The convention then instituted mass conscription into the military, and all military-aged men were eligible for service, and France's ranks began to swell, and just through weight of number, the French military began to push back the Austrians and the Prussians. They began winning the war, but it took them some time. This is a painting of the storming of the Tuileries Palace, and I'm putting this up for a very specific reason. There's a very young 20-year-old that witnessed this. That 20-year-old was named Napoleon Bonaparte. Anybody know anything about Napoleon Bonaparte? Career soldier, conqueror, spent his entire adult life at war. He later wrote in his memoirs that what he saw at the Tuileries Palace was worse than anything he had ever seen on a battlefield. The savagery of the violence directed against the Swiss Guard left an indelible mark on Napoleon's mind, and he never trusted the people again. Because Napoleon was very big into the revolution. But after what he saw at the Tuileries Palace, he's like, if you give the mob power, they will murder you with it. And that's why when Napoleon got power, he became a dictator. Because he didn't trust anybody holding power because of what he saw at Tuileries. The convention ended up successfully quelling royalist uprisings across France. And then the French army ended up driving the Austrians and the Prussians into retreat. A man named Maximilien Robespierre became the head of the convention and officially ended the French First Republic and ordered the execution of Louis XVI. quote, "Louis must die so the nation may live." But there's something that's very interesting about Robespierre. We know a lot about Robespierre's life. When Robespierre was a student at one of the academies in Paris, Louis made a stop, like a pit stop at this academy. It was kind of like a tradition. He'd show up, and then the students would heap praise upon him, and then he'd wave to him and then disappear. The student that was selected to give this soliloquy in Latin praising Louis and all his grandeur was Maximilien Robespierre. So Maximilien Robespierre is a young man, devout royalist as a young guy, wrote the letter to Louis, "You do consume in one day what the average citizen eats in a year," and then ordered Louis' death. Robespierre also viewed himself as a voice of the common people. Once he graduated, he became a lawyer, and he worked for the lower classes. He was anti-war. As a member of the National Assembly, he voted against declaring war on Austria and Prussia. He was also anti-capital punishment. When the vote came that to begin killing enemies of the revolution, he voted against execution. He preferred exile. Maximilien Robespierre would later order the executions of 40,000 people. You're like, what? I know, I saw your reaction. Maximilien Robespierre went from being anti-war to being pro-war, went from being anti-capital punishment to being one of the most violent purveyors of capital punishment. And one of his friends called him out on it. He's like, "Whoa, Max, weren't you against all of this death and killing?" And his only response was, "Well, times have changed, people change."
All it took him was to kill Louis.
All it took him was for him to get power.
Oh, yeah, that's
So with Louis dead, all of the nations of Europe intensified their war effort in order to stop the revolution, kill the revolution in its tracks. So Louis was the most entrenched monarchy in the old order of Europe. And the Europeans were like, if the French can kill Louis, no monarch is safe. Yes.
So when he died, what happened to his wife?
She was kept under house arrest. They ended up executing her about a month later.
And the children?
The children were distributed to revolutionaries. Their son was essentially beaten to death. He was 7 years old. 7 or 8 years old, little kid. Their children were given to leaders of the revolution, and their treatment was awful because the leaders that took over them tried to essentially beat the fact that they were noble out of them. Louis XVII, the little boy, ended up dying of a combination of abuse and neglect. So. But all the other monarchs in Europe no longer saw France as one of their national rivals. They saw this as an existential threat because Louis is dead. He's the most entrenched monarch in Europe. And if Louis can be killed by his own people, how long until the revolution spreads? So all of the monarchies were like, we've got to kill this in its tracks. So they started attacking France with this renewed ferocity. And the convention was essentially paralyzed because the war effort started crumbling again. So the convention created the Committee of Public Safety, which was a council granted dictator power in order to control the war effort and control internal dissent. Now the Committee of Public Safety is one of the worst named organizations in history because it really wasn't much of a committee because Robespierre ran the whole thing, and it wasn't dedicated to public safety because it killed a bunch of people. Robespierre became a dictator through this. Marie Antoinette was caught in the bickering of this and executed by guillotine. Her trial was a sham. They accused her of everything under the sun. They even accused her of incest with her son.
Wow.
And that was like one of the only times she stood up in her trial and defended herself because they were just showering her with insults. You Austrian whore, you've led our country astray, blah, blah, blah. And as soon as they accused her of, this incest thing, she stood up and she's like, I asked the women in the room, how can any of you levy a charge like that, something so horrible against a mother? And all the women in the room were like, oh man, we fucked up. That was like the one moment of sympathy she ever got. But even the way that she was executed was pretty bad because when Louis was sent off to the platform with the guillotine to be beheaded, they put him in a cart with a carriage with curtains over the windows so people would see him, so he didn't have to see the crowd, and he basically got some privacy. And then when he went up onto the scaffold, he was allowed to address the people and kind of say his last words, and it was something like, I hope my death brings the happiness that France so desperately deserves, or something like that. And then off with his head. Marie Antoinette was put in a common criminal's cart. So just like this open cage. So people were throwing shit at her, they were insulting her, and she was being, hauled to the scaffold. And then when she climbed up on the scaffold, she tried to say something to the crowd, but the executioner ordered soldiers to start beating drums. The last thing that we know Marie Antoinette did or said is she accidentally stepped on the executioner's foot, and she says, "I'm so sorry," and that's the last thing she said.
Wow.
So
She was really
yeah, they did her dirty.
the kid.
So. Between 1793 and 1794, the Committee of Public Safety cracked down on anti-revolutionary sentiment. They implemented a policy called terror. Robespierre thought that he could use terror to institute what he called a republic of virtue. It's like, let terror be the day to let terror be the word to those who would stand against the revolution. An estimated 40,000 people were executed. Another 300,000 people were put in prison. Very few of the victims of the terror were guilty of anything. You could be executed for some of the dumbest reasons possible. So the Committee of Public Safety had informants all over the country, but mostly in Paris. If you said something negative about the revolution, you died. If you said something positive about the monarchy, you died. If you complained about the price of bread, you died. If you were not enthusiastic enough about the way things were going, you died. If you addressed someone you didn't know as Madame, Mademoiselle, or Monsieur, you died. Yes, so in an effort to try to create and force equality throughout French society, the Committee of Public Safety deemed that the proper terms of address, Madame, Mademoiselle, Monsieur, were terms and titles that were given to the nobility. So they said if you have to address somebody you don't know, you call them citoyen, citizen. So if you came in, "Oh, good evening, ma'am," or something like that, off to the cart.
And what happens if you don't say anything at all? Because I just want to talk.
Ah, you're an enemy of the revolution. You can die for anything.
They have no lawyers or anything to stand up to them or anything.
Nope, sham trials. Sham trials. Mob rule, essentially what it is. Robespierre took power and he's like, I am going to kill all the bad people to usher in utopia.
Okay, somebody needs to kill him.
There were people that supported him in the terror and actually agreed with his methods that he ended up killing because they weren't extreme enough. He's like, yeah, Robespierre, I'm totally with you. Go kill all those people. Oh, how you doing, monsieur? What'd you say? There was a guy, a founding member of the Jacobin movement named George Danton. George Danton founded the Jacobins, supported the terror, and then when the war effort turned and the French started winning battles, he came up to Robespierre and said, okay, I think we've made our point. I think we can slow down on the killing. And Robespierre said, you must be an enemy to the revolution. And had him killed. The founding member of the Jacobin Club. George Danton's last words, my only regret is I'm dying before that rat Robespierre.
Wow. I like it.
There was a French feminist, her name was Olympe de Gouges. She wanted to extend legal equality to women. They cut her head off for that. She's like, hey, maybe you should treat women the same as men. Oh, how dare you. Enemy of the revolution. Off with your head. The moderate faction of the convention, a group called the Girondins, they were wiped out. All of them were killed. Robespierre then began promoting what he called a cult of reason, to go with his republic of virtue. So here's how he justified terror. He says, what was it? Virtue without terror is meaningless, but terror without virtue is powerless. I may have gotten that reversed. Think about that. Yeah, terror without virtue is powerless, and virtue without terror is meaningless. Robespierre was essentially saying if we can kill all the bad people, essentially what he wanted to do was use terror, use the threat of execution, use fear to convince all French citizens to become diligent activists for the glory of the revolution. In any way possible. Joining the military, putting together food drives, killing anti-revolutionaries. He wanted to create, by fear, a society to where everybody works for the glory of the state. There's somebody else who tried to do the same thing in the 20th century. His name was Adolf Hitler. So Robespierre began promoting a cult of reason which sought to destroy the power of the church wherever possible. A lot of Jacobins were atheists, and they thought that the best way to really free French society from all vestiges of the ancient past was to also de-Christianize the country. So a new calendar was created composed of 10-day work weeks with no religious holidays, no Christmas, no Easter, none of that, no rest periods, so there'd be no Sunday. Priests were forced to get married and break their vows of celibacy. Basically what would happen is revolutionaries would grab priests and grab nuns and be like, okay, have sex. Get married and have sex. And they'd be like, no, my vow of celibacy is to God and to God only. Be like, oh, shame for you. Take the priest, take the nun, tie him up, throw him in a river, let him drown. I know, right? During the, where was I talking about this? Did I screw this up? Yeah, during the terror in an area called the Loire Valley, there was kind of a royalist stronghold. The Revolutionary Army went in, ended up executing 4,000 people by mass drowning. It's called the drowning in the Loire River, because they didn't have a guillotine. So what they did is they took all the people, the enemies of the revolution, packed them onto barges, and then sank the barges. There was one guy that survived that drowning, and that's because he was a competition swimmer. They tried to drown him twice. He got away the second time. Like, fuck you! So. But they had these boats that were specially made for this. They'd be a boat without any floor, and it would float by pontoon. And it'd be crewed by 2 or 3 members of the revolutionaries, and they basically put the boat out in the middle of the river, throw their victims in the center of the boat, and then use a pole to push their heads underwater until they drown. There were other parts of France where they would line people up in a field in front of like a ditch or like a open grave that they would dig, and then line up cannons and load the cannons with like nails and pieces of horseshoe and metal scraps, and turn the cannons into giant shotguns, and then just blow them all away. Nice people, right? Very nice. All under the order of this guy. So Robespierre was not an atheist. But he wasn't much of a Christian either. Gee, who'd have thought? But he did feel that the people of France needed some kind of religion. He didn't quite embrace the complete atheistic views of his fellow Jacobins. So he wanted to just create a new religion. That's why he created the cult of reason, or the cult of the supreme being, that worshipped the goddess of reason. Oh, and one of the saints, quote-unquote saints, in this pantheon of the cult of the supreme being, Marat. So he created the cult of the supreme being as a new religion of state, and he was the head of it. What led to the downfall of Robespierre was the festival of the supreme being. So in 1794, Robespierre called a halting to all of the killings and called a festival, this gigantic party that was to be held in Paris. And he was going to do the unraveling or the unveiling of this new religion, the cult of reason, or the cult of the supreme being that worships the goddess of reason. And they had all the fanfare, all the food that you can think of, parties, music, that kind of thing. And they had this gigantic mountain built kind of out of paper mache. And at the end, or the climax of the festival, Robespierre climbs on top of this mountain in a toga and addresses the crowd as if he's Caesar. And all the Jacobins looked at him and they're like, who does this guy think he is? Does he think he's God? And that basically sealed Robespierre's fate. Because that's when the Jacobins begin conspiring to kill him. Yes? And eventually the entire convention turned against him.
No, but
Mm-hmm. Oh, how'd they kill him?
yeah.
I'll get there. Relax. Don't read ahead. Robespierre's biggest problem is like all tyrants, he had made too many enemies that he could kill. Mainly other Jacobins. So, with his downfall, he had heard rumors that Jacobins were starting to conspire against him. So he went into the assembly, to the chamber, and he addressed the convention. And he says, I have a list of criminals and enemies of the revolution that are going to be off to the guillotine. But I'm not going to tell you right now. I'll tell you tomorrow. And he leaves. And everybody in the convention is like, oh my God, what if I'm on that list? What if he's going to use this as a purge for all of us? So Robespierre comes back in the next day. He's like, I am going to read the list of traitors. And everybody in the convention is like, shut the fuck up. And they just like start shouting at him, just hurling insults at him. And Robespierre's like, whoa, what's going on? And he couldn't, he was being called a traitor. He was being called a murderer, a tyrant, a megalomaniac, and that kind of thing. Robespierre, for the first time in his life, was shocked into speechless. Being speechless, he's like, I can't say a word. So armed guards came in, they grabbed him and a couple of his followers, funneled him into a room in another part of the building, and locked him up. And then the convention had a conversation. Okay, what do we do with him now? Well, while he's in that room, he's talking to his buddies. He's like, oh yeah, they're going to kill us. They're going to kill us. This is awful. And one of them was like, they'll never take me alive. And he jumps out the window, kills himself. Another guy takes out a pistol, shoots himself in the head. Robespierre's like, I'm going to do the same thing. He pulls out a pistol, goes to shoot himself in the head, and misses.
Wow.
He shot himself in the jaw. How the hell do you shoot yourself in the jaw? So the people in the convention hear the gunfire. They run into the room where Robespierre's lined up. They see one guy who's dead with bullet hole in his head. Another guy just jumped out the window without a parachute. And then there's Robespierre slumped over on his desk, quivering, blood everywhere. And everybody's like, this fucking moron right here. And they just start showering him with insults and, you're an idiot, you're dumb, you tyrant, this is what you get, and that kind of thing. And the next day, he was taken out to the guillotine and got his head chopped off. His death ended the terror. And that's kind of the ironic thing about the terror, because by the time the terror was about to come to an end, a lot of Jacobins thought that it really should come to an end, but they didn't know how to end it. So the natural conclusion was end it by killing the man who started it.
Yeah, that makes sense.
With Robespierre dead, the convention fell apart. And power ended up transferring to a new form of government called the Directory. The Directory was an oligarchy. It was extremely weak. Its only authority really came from the military, specifically Napoleon Bonaparte. Speaking of Napoleon, let's talk about him.
What happened to his mother? Did it all die?
And they just stopped.
A lot of them faded into obscurity. Some of them were imprisoned. Some of them were killed.
I want to ask a question, but I don't think it's part of that. Is this reasoning before or after the times of when people take people to Spain to Lisbon?
When what?
Is this what we're studying right now before or after the Lisbon trials? When they take people to Lisbon in Spain?
I'm actually drawing a blank on that, so I honestly don't know. Yeah, I'm sorry.
Okay, I'll tell you about it later.
Oh man, you called me on something. Now I gotta look it up.
You will be killed for that. That ain't everybody.
What's up? You got me.
You will be killed for that.
You're
supposed to know. It was like the king of Spain, and then everybody Christopher Columbus, everybody they was saying, I don't even know if he was.
Oh, if it was Christopher Columbus, then it was long before this.
No, I don't know if people there is that crew. But I know if you did something bad, then you had to report to Spain.
It was called the Lisbon Trials.
Something like that was trials, whatever. They would take.
Was it part of the Spanish Inquisition?
I'm not sure.
Because if that was the case, then it happened before the
That
French
there's
Revolution.
still catacombs under Lisbon, and you can see there's still people buried under there.
I want to say it was before the French Revolution, but like I said, I'm drawing a blank. I honestly don't know.
Okay,
So.
that's everybody there.
We'll look it up actually. We'll look it up after class. Because now I'm curious. Now you got me all messed up. I'm going to have to edit this out of my video and everything. All right, Napoleon. What do y'all know about Napoleon? Everybody tells me he was short.
He was? What do you guys consider short?
That's what they said.
He was
He was very short.
He was advertised.
Yeah, he was average height actually. All right, so let me put the short thing to rest. Napoleon was 5'2" in French inches. Now I know 5'2", you think, oh man, this 5'2", you know, little, like Bruno Mars small, okay? No, French inches are actually longer than the English inch that we use in the imperial system.
Okay.
So converting French inches to what we use, he was like 5'7", 5'8". So very average.
Above average.
Very average. He wasn't tall, but he wasn't short either.
So that Napoleon complex thing is.
Okay, so the Napoleon complex. I know, like when the Chihuahua picks a fight with a pit bull, like, no, this ain't gonna end well.
I thought you were at 4 feet.
That's a caricature from the people that didn't like him. They're like, oh yeah, he came up to my kneecap, you know? Like he was an Oompa Loompa with a funny hat.
Wasn't he in Shrek? Like the little woman that couldn't get on the thing?
Wait, the what?
He was in Shrek, Napoleon. He was the one that could, like, the little
Oh yeah, King Farquaad or whatever his name was.
He couldn't get on the horse, that's how short he was.
Yeah, that's kind of a joke about the Napoleon complex, but no, Napoleon was not that short. Napoleon was actually pretty good on horseback, yes.
So it's better to be feared than loved.
That was actually Niccolò Machiavelli.
Oh, really?
Yep, in his book called The Prince. That's a fascinating book for you guys to read. It's also really short. Niccolò Machiavelli, The Prince. It's pretty good insight into... It pretty much got the ball rolling for Enlightenment political theory. Machiavelli did not trust people at all. He was the one that wrote, if you had a choice between loved and feared, it's better to be feared than loved. How many of you know that Napoleon was not actually French? Napoleon was Italian. Napoleon was born on the island of Corsica, which was ceded to France around the time Napoleon was born. I have to double check the date. It was either ceded to France either right before Napoleon was born or right after. But he was born Napoleonic Bonaparte. And he dropped a couple of vowels when he moved to France. His classmates used to ridicule him for his name. They called him Napoleonic, which is French for like you have a piece of straw in your nose. And that's what they made fun of him.
Straw.
Yep, straw. Hey, straw nose. But yeah, he was Italian. His family his parents were low aristocracy, I guess you can say. They weren't particularly highborn, but they weren't common. They were nobles. And because of their position in Italian society, they were able to send Napoleon to a military academy. He never really lost his Italian accent. And growing up, he was ridiculed mercilessly for it. He actually grew up hating France. He's like, it's a horrible country full of horrible people. He once threatened his classmates that he was going to bring ruin onto France as vengeance for his treatment, or their treatment of him. But when the revolution started, he got really into it. Okay. Deeds of renown. Napoleon was clearly an ambitious fellow and a go-getter. He was promoted to the rank of general when he was 24 years old in 1793. He was promoted to general. In 1795, he protected the Directory from overthrow. Remember how I said that Napoleon witnessed the killing at the Tuileries Palace? In 1795, what was left of the Jacobins and a couple other more radical revolutionaries saw the Directory as a sellout or a betrayal of the revolution. And they put together a mob or a crowd that was going to attack the Directory, kill the Directory, and start a new wave of the revolution. And the Directory called in the troops in order to defend their position, and Napoleon was the one in charge of the soldiers who were called into Paris. Rather than corral the crowd and do crowd control, Napoleon ordered his men to open fire into the crowd. And he killed hundreds of them. He fired into them with muskets, with cannons, all kinds of stuff. One historian would later write that Napoleon cleared the streets of Paris with a whiff of grape shot. Grape shot are essentially ball bearings about that big that you load into a cannon and turn the cannon into a giant shotgun.
Why was he so famous? Like, why was he like this whole ideal?
Napoleon is considered to be one of the greatest generals to ever live. If you were to take all of the generals across history, Napoleon will consistently be considered in the top 5.
General meaning like high rank?
Soldier.
Okay.
No, just commander. He was
Why? Because he
very
was
good
smart.
at war.
Was smart, or he was like physical ability?
Not physical ability, his brains.
Strategic.
Napoleon knew how to win battles, and he knew what to do with them once he won it. He revolutionized warfare for his age. So he protected the Directory from overthrow in 1795. As I guess you could say a thank you for the Directory put him in command of gave him a field command, and put him in charge of an entire theater of war. They put him in charge of the Italian campaign. Northern Italy was mostly under the control of the Austrians when the French Revolution broke out, so the Austrians were sending troops through northern Italy to attack France's western border in the south. And the French were getting their asses handed to them in the south. The Italian campaign was a total nightmare. So Napoleon was put in charge of that campaign because it was a prestigious position and because the Directory thought that he'd be able to stabilize the situation and secure France's borders. Napoleon took over his troops and found them underfed, undersupplied, and poorly trained, and he turned them into an army of fanatics. The entire Austrian campaign, or Italian campaign, this will demonstrate just a very small measure on why Napoleon is considered one of the best generals to ever live. Napoleon, when you look at the theater itself, he was outnumbered by a factor of like 3 to 1. But every battle he fought in northern Italy, he brought more men and more cannons to the fight than the other guy did. So despite being outnumbered overall, every time he fought a battle, he had the numerical advantage. Because he favored speed.
And he was overprepared.
And he was overprepared. He also revolutionized how to use artillery in combat. So artillery was originally designed to just support the infantry, and Napoleon's like, no, we're going to use artillery as an entire new branch of the military, and let the artillery just rain hell on the enemy troops.
But doesn't make sense. You said he was outnumbered 3 to 1, but then he always brought more men and more.
Because the Austrians were trying to garrison multiple positions, and what Napoleon got really good at doing is he would take his army and he would break it into smaller pieces. An army that is smaller in number moves faster because it doesn't consume as much supply. So by breaking his army into smaller pieces, he'd be able to maneuver around, and the Austrians would try to keep up with it, to like chop up pieces of the French army. So what Napoleon would do is he'd break his army into smaller pieces and then get the Austrians to chase him. And in order for the Austrians to keep up, they would break their army into smaller pieces too, and then he would recombine his army and pick them off one at a time. By the way, that's how the Texans won their independence during their war with Mexico. Because Sam Houston broke his army into a couple of smaller pieces to get Santa Anna to follow him. And Santa Anna broke his army into smaller pieces. And Sam Houston recombined his army and attacked the chunk that was being commanded by Santa Anna, destroying that part of the army and capturing Santa Anna. He was numerically outnumbered, but at the Battle of San Jacinto, he still had the advantage. And he basically copied what Napoleon did. So Napoleon took over a position that the French government thought was almost irreversible. And he not only stabilized the frontier for the French holdings in Italy, he kicked the Austrians out of Italy. And it made him a national hero. They then sent him to Egypt. He fought a battle outside of the pyramids. And then in 1799, he returned to Paris and overthrew the Directory. And decided, you know what? I'm going to run the show. In 1802, he was crowned emperor. Here's a painting, or this is a zoom-in. This painting is a lot bigger in reality, but this is a zoom-in portion of Napoleon coronating his wife Josephine as empress. A couple things that you can get from Napoleon's coronation as emperor. The title emperor is a Roman title. It comes from the title imperator. And in order to carry the title emperor and have it mean something, have legitimacy, it's got to be bestowed by the church. Because the Roman Catholic Church is the last vestige of the Roman Empire. So they control who gets to be called emperor, really. And Napoleon wanted that title. Now, you can claim to be emperor all you want, but until the church recognizes you as emperor, you have no legitimacy of the title. It's just an empty title.
He has to get exported or something.
You have to be coronated by the Pope.
Yeah,
Yep. So Napoleon had to, but Napoleon wanted to be emperor. He wanted to create a title that would, give him complete control of France and kind of restore the national prestige of France. But this is a country that just spent several years of trying to destroy everything of the Catholic Church in France. So Napoleon had some serious negotiating to do with the Catholic Church. And he ended up entering into negotiations with the Pope and agreed to an agreement called the Concordat. And it was a pretty good agreement that really healed the rift between the church and France. France would retain church land and property and continue paying the salaries of the clerics, but Catholicism was made the official religion of state again. But on the condition that France could also grant freedom of worship to Jews and Protestants, because Napoleon didn't want a repeat of the religious violence. Napoleon subscribed to religious toleration. The Gregorian calendar was also reinstated. The cult of the supreme being was outlawed in 1802, and with this agreement, Napoleon was crowned emperor. Napoleon's popularity also skyrocketed. Some of you were probably very religious. Some of you know people who are very religious. If you lived in a country that essentially told you, you cannot worship God, either you in the room who are religious or you who know people that are religious, are you going to say, well, I guess I can't believe in God anymore, or are you going to go underground?
Underground.
You're going to go underground. So when the Jacobins tried to de-Christianize the country, all they did is they just drove all the practicing Catholics underground. And Napoleon comes in and said, it's okay to be Catholic again. So now all of these Catholics are coming out, oh, thank God for Napoleon. And then that crappy calendar with 10-day work weeks and no Sundays, which means no football, was removed and replaced with the calendar that we use was then reinstated. Another thing about this painting, this is pretty cool. Napoleon's coronation. So the way that the ceremony was supposed to work was that the Pope was going to come in with the crown and then place the crown on Napoleon's head. But Napoleon is like, oh, no. Because with that action, that is essentially telling everybody watching the coronation that the Pope makes me. And Napoleon's like, I'm going to show the world that I make myself. So the Pope's coming up with the crown, and Napoleon gets out of the throne, grabs the crown, thank you, and sticks it on his own head. And the Pope's sitting there like, the fuck just happened? And then he crowned Josephine. The relationship between Napoleon and Josephine was really interesting. She was an older woman. She loved to torture him. It was pretty funny. He ended up having to divorce her because she was barren and couldn't have any children. But his second wife, Napoleon had no love for. He told his friends with his second wife that he married nothing more than a womb. Josephine was his true love. Some of the letters that he wrote back and forth between them was actually, have survived, and they're pretty funny. Like, he was on campaign, and he used to write these ridiculous love stories.
There's a book about that, like his love letters, something like that.
Yeah, his love letters were something else, man. So he would write all these steamy love letters, like, I can't wait to see you, I long to see your face. Please, if you don't reply to me, I will die. And then she wouldn't reply to him. He was left on red. So he would follow it up, like, if you don't reply to me, I will march back to Paris and I will stab you with my little sword. And I'm just like, whoa, chill down, Casanova. You don't have to think too hard about what he meant by that. Oh, now you get it. Oh, she tortured him, and she loved it. Anyway, so 2 years after healing the rift between the Church and France, Napoleon then turned his attention to the Civic Code. So in 1804, he implemented the Civil Code. We call it the Napoleonic Code. A couple of things that reformed France's, I can speak today, France's legal system. All men were granted legal equality. A merit-based society was established. Before Napoleon, if you wanted to make it in French society, you had to be related to somebody. It was all based on birthright. But Napoleon came in and said, no, we're getting rid of that and we're going to institute a meritocracy, which means the best people for the job will hold the job, whether it be in the military, whether it be in the government, didn't matter. So like, under the rule of the Bourbons, if you wanted to be an officer in the French military, you had to be the son of somebody important. In Napoleon's military, you could be a conscript that was pushed into service, establish yourself as a good soldier, and then get promoted all the way to general. And that happened. Like, a lot. No, in many ways, Napoleon probably did more reforms than the revolutionaries did. In some ways. In other ways, he was a tyrant. So birthright no longer carried any weight in government, military service, or economic activity. Napoleon also affirmed the right to private property, which encouraged a lot of the aristocracy that left during the Great Terror to come back to France. And they came back and they brought their money with them, which Napoleon taxed. On the flip side, however, Napoleon also codified patriarchal rule of the family, which meant that all family decisions were to be done by the men. So any of the inroads, any of the progress that women made during the revolution, Napoleon reversed most of it.
Right.
So like during the revolution under the rule of Robespierre, divorce was eligible for mutual consent, which means both parties could file for divorce. Napoleon got rid of that and said the only divorce that can happen now is if the man approves of it. I have a feeling that was related to the Concordat though, because the Catholic Church doesn't like divorce.
Oh.
Do you think it had to do property with him and?
He divorced Josephine after the fact, so not before. He divorced Josephine in like 1810. Couple of things that he did with the legal system. Secret laws were really big under the monarchy, and especially under the Jacobins, so Napoleon got rid of all of those. So he decreed that laws could only be enforced if they had been officially published and or publicly declared or displayed. No more secret laws, because the monarchs were notorious for doing that. Writing a law that no one would know was on the books, so they could bust you for it.
Wow.
By the way, there are secret laws on the books in the United States. Yep. And they occasionally get pulled out whenever local jurisdictions need money to write tickets.
Wow.
They're not supposed to exist, but they do exist. I mean, they're in the legal code, but I mean, who's going to read that entire legal code? It's like 80 volumes. Existing secret laws were all thrown out. Ex post facto laws were also banned. Does anybody know what an ex post facto law is?
No.
Ex post facto is Latin for after the fact. And what an ex post facto law is, it's a law that's passed, and then anybody who broke that law is retroactively punished. So let's say, for example, after this class, everybody goes out and gets a beer. So you've all drank alcohol today, right? And then tomorrow, prohibition is put back in place. But it's an ex post facto prohibition. What that means is that the government can go back and say, hey, even though the law wasn't on the books when you drank alcohol, you technically violated this law and you all get a ticket for it. That's an ex post facto law.
What?
And the monarchs used to do that a lot. So if they had a political opponent that they didn't like, they would get a new law passed that that opponent had violated and then go back and retroactively punish them.
Oh,
Even though you didn't know about it.
Even though the law didn't exist when you did it.
Oh, you did it, yeah.
Right. So that's how an ex post facto law works, and Napoleon got rid of all of them. Napoleon also granted a little bit of flexibility with the legal system, specifically with how judges determine cases. Napoleon kind of addressed that age-old question, which is more important, the letter of the law or the spirit of the law? Because the monarchs preferred the letter of the law. Napoleon preferred the spirit of the law. So he gave the judges a little bit of flexibility in determining court cases. So for example, if you were starving and your family was starving and you stole a loaf of bread to feed your family and you were arrested by the monarchy didn't care why you stole the loaf of bread. The letter of the law is, you are a thief, you go to prison. Right? Regardless of what happens to your family. Under Napoleon, that situation, the judge would be able to grant clemency to that criminal and say, okay, you stole the loaf of bread, you did commit theft, but you did it to feed your starving family, so I'm not going to send you to prison, you have to do community service instead.
It was more fair.
So that's what Napoleon did. So he changed the legal system to give a little bit of flexibility to the courts. He also decriminalized blasphemy, heresy, sacrilege, witchcraft, and homosexuality. It wasn't legal, but you were no longer imprisoned or executed for being gay, or for taking God's name in vain, or for practicing voodoo, or practicing witchcraft, or anything like that. Napoleon's like, whatever you do in your own time, it's not my concern. Now, despite these reforms, which are significant, Napoleon still ruled as a dictator. Free speech was limited. Newspapers were frequently censored. By the end of Napoleon's reign, there was only like 5 or 6 newspapers left in France, and all of them were under the control of the government. Napoleon also had a secret police that would crack down on political dissent. So people that were speaking out against Napoleon in public would be arrested, they'd be imprisoned, they'd be disappeared, they'd be exiled. He widely used propaganda. Now, Napoleon allowed elected bodies to exist, but he also ignored them. So, now Napoleon's true strength was in his military prowess. European powers frequently ganged up on Napoleonic-era France. Alliances of multiple countries all coordinating their efforts in order to pulverize Napoleon. And Napoleon would beat them. And not just beat them, he would crush them. Like in 1805, for example, Napoleon's greatest victory is called the Battle of Austerlitz. He took on 3 armies and won. At the height of Napoleon's power, Napoleon had control of pretty much all of Europe, except Great Britain. So this is a map of Napoleon's empire. Everything in the dark green are things that fell under Napoleon's direct rule. Everything in the light green was something that Napoleon would rule through a proxy or a puppet. Like, for example, in 1810, which is what this map is, Spain was under the control of Napoleon's brother, Joseph. But Joseph danced to Napoleon's tune. And he never got Great Britain. He tried to. Yes?
They never fought against each other. Like, let's say, I know around that time, I believe it was the Ottoman Empire you were known to, right?
Wait, yeah, the Ottoman Empire, yeah?
It was going on at that same time. They couldn't fight each other. Like, the Ottoman Empire would fight, like, Napoleon.
Napoleon, when he was in Egypt in 1798, tried to invade the Ottoman Empire, and they kicked him out. But yeah, the Ottoman Empire was still kind of poking around here. Yeah, this is the Ottoman Empire down here, but Napoleon like never invaded it, never got control of it.
They were really sad, right? Like they were really those the Ottoman Empire, right? They were really like smart.
By the 1800s, they were on the decline. But I mean, the Ottoman Empire in 1810 still had teeth, and they decided that it would be better to not mess with Napoleon. So, looking at this map, I mean, he's got control of France, Spain, what is now modern Germany, Italy, Prussia, Austria, all of Russia. You'd think, oh my God, how did he have all of this control and how did he lose? Because, you know, light green are things that he's puppeted, dark green are what he controls directly, and purple were allies. So he was allies with Austria, Prussia, and Russia. It's actually kind of funny what happened with this. So after the Battle of Austerlitz, right, it's also known as the Battle of the Three Emperors, because Napoleon was there, the Austrian Emperor was there, and the Tsar roughly translates to Emperor, it technically translates to Caesar, but whatever, they claim to be the Roman Empire. All 3 of them had the title of Emperor. Only Napoleon had the title granted by the church. So it's called the Battle of the Three Emperors, and Napoleon won. He defeated the Prussians, the Austrians, and the Russians. And the defeated coalition, the Austrians, the Prussians, and the Russians, decided that they were going to let Tsar Alexander of Russia be their representative at the peace talks. So Napoleon kind of pumps himself up. He's like, all right, you're the man, Napoleon, you're going to do this. And he's about to go into the tent with Tsar Alexander. He's like, you're going to put these Russians in their place, and they're going to bow to you. And then he goes into the tent, and he sits down, and he has a conversation with Alexander, and they fall in love with each other. Not literally. They became BFFs. So Napoleon's like, I'm going to charm Alexander. And Alexander's like, I'm going to charm Napoleon. And they go into the tent enemies, and they come out, you know, with their arms around it, they're drinking, and they're like, let's go hunting together, everybody. And just like, oh. And these countries, which started the day as Napoleon's enemies, ended the day as Napoleon's allies. So how did he fail? Strangely enough, what led to Napoleon being defeated was that he was too good. He was too good a reformer. So Napoleon would subjugate all of these areas and begin taking the reforms in France and applying it to the countries that he subjugated. So the meritocracy system, which gave France a significant advantage in terms of military power and government efficiency, was now being applied to Prussia and Austria. Universal conscription, which is what allowed the French military to outnumber their opponents at most engagements, was now being applied to Prussia, Austria, and Russia. Essentially what these European powers were doing is they were reforming in order to fight Napoleon. Napoleon was reforming to make France powerful. Everybody else was reforming to defeat France. As long as Britain controlled the oceans, however, Napoleon was vulnerable because his strength was in the army and Britain's strength was in its fleets. In 1805, Napoleon tried to defeat the British Navy at the Battle of Trafalgar, and they lost. And that prevented Napoleon from ever really being a credible threat to invading England. If Napoleon had landed troops on English shores, Napoleon would have died in power. Oh, by the way, speaking of the whole thing with political dissenters and Napoleon ruling as a dictator, the admiral of the French fleet, a guy named Admiral Villeneuve, was put on trial for the destruction of his fleet. He went through a court-martial, military tribunal, and he was found not guilty of doing anything wrong. So the military tribunal just essentially concluded, you fought well, you fought hard, but you were outmaneuvered by a better enemy. No shame in that. And he was exonerated of any wrongdoing of his defeat. He was found dead a couple of days later at a roadside inn, stabbed multiple times in the back. It was ruled a suicide.
How could you? Exactly.
You really can't. But
Oh my God.
That's crazy.
it's like, you lose my fleet, you lose your life. So after Napoleon's failure to really weaken the British Navy, and pretty much the British Navy killing any chance that he had of successfully invading Britain, Napoleon then turned to economic warfare in order to force England to submit to his rule. And he implemented an economic system called the Continental System. The Continental System was, he told all of the countries that it controlled and all of his allies, don't trade with Britain. Starve Britain into submission. But it was a severe miscalculation, because the biggest problem that Napoleon did not take into account is Britain had an empire. Nobody in Europe did. So Britain had colonies. They didn't notice the lack of trade. They're like, oh, boo-hoo, I'm not trading with the Russians. I'll go trade with the Americans. Or I'll go trade with Mexico. Or I'll go trade with my colonies. Britain didn't notice it. Europe was cut off from all of the exotic goods, however, that they were getting from Britain. So their economies crumbled. Now here's the really crappy thing. If the Continental System was set up to be a free trade organization, Napoleon would have died in power, because all of the countries in Europe would have been able to benefit from France's economy. But it wasn't. The Continental System was set up to benefit France at the expense of everybody else. Don't you think that's going to make some enemies? So, going back to this map actually, Spain was the first country to break from the Continental System because of their proximity to British trade lanes. British trade lanes would come through the English Channel and then sweep around Spain. So the Spanish, all they had to do was just get in their ships, go out to meet with the British in the middle of the ocean and start trading through ocean trade. Or, British ships would land in Spanish ports and that kind of thing. And that angered Napoleon because Spain was supposed to be his ally. So Napoleon responded by putting his brother Joseph on the throne of Spain. Problem is, Joseph is French. Do you think the French citizen or the Spanish citizens would bow to a French king?
No.
No way. Now the military in Spain swears fealty to the throne of Spain, whoever sits on it. So they were loyal to Joseph just because of their vow, but the people of Spain weren't. Do you know what guerrilla warfare is?
That's what we do now. We run around instead of being in a formation, like the British did, where they started a formation to shoot. They could do whatever they want, basically.
Yeah, kind of. We actually don't do guerrilla warfare because guerrilla warfare is what the poor name of guerrilla warfare is. It's usually referred to as the poor man's war. Guerrilla warfare is used as hit and run tactics. So soldiers that participate in guerrilla warfare don't wear uniforms. Think about the Iraqi insurgency after the US invaded Iraq. So they dress like civilians, do hit and run attacks against American convoys, that kind of thing. Guerrilla warfare is designed to delay and to weaken the enemy over time. And it's usually fought by countries that don't have the resources to fight a traditional war with uniforms and tanks and airplanes, that kind of thing.
Didn't America do it to the British when we fought them?
Oh, we did I'm sorry. I didn't realize you were talking about the American Revolution. Yes, what we did in the Revolution was guerrilla warfare. So, dress like regular common citizens, hide behind rocks and trees, shoot a redcoat, run away.
Wow.
We get the term guerrilla warfare from what the Spaniards called themselves fighting Napoleon. Guerrillas, little warriors. So that word comes from the Spanish. Guerrilla. So the Spanish rebelled against the rule of Joseph and started shooting Spanish troops, started assassinating Spanish authorities. Napoleon sent troops into Spain to put the rebellion down, but the French would camp at night, and the guerrillas would come out from the darkness, shoot a couple of sentries, set something on fire, run away. The next night they'd do the same thing. And Napoleon fought in Spain for 7 years, from 1807 to 1814. He lost so many men, and he lost so much in supply and material, he had no choice but to pull out. And what that meant was the veneer of invincibility was destroyed. So Napoleon, going in 1807, was invincible. He was at the top of his game. And then he gets a very bloody nose in Spain, and now everybody in Europe is like, well, if the Spanish can defeat Napoleon, we can defeat Napoleon. So in 1812, the Russians broke from the continental system. This is a painting of Napoleon in Moscow. So Napoleon, in response to Russia betraying him, remember, Napoleon and Alexander wooed each other. They went into the 10 enemies, they came out BFFs. So when Alexander broke from the continental system, Napoleon took this as a personal attack, rather than Alexander trying to break from the continental system to save the economy of his country. Napoleon's like, you've betrayed me. So he put together an army of 600,000 men and invaded Russia.
How would they put the army? Or just go into people's houses and you gotta come fight?
Oh, Napoleon did recruitment drives, and he did have different parts of the French military kind of scattered all over the place. But usually what he would do is conscription. So letters would be sent to the home. Congratulations, your son's been drafted into the Grand Army.
And that was an honor, or was it like
a lot of people did want to fight because they thought, hey, Napoleon's the man. I want to get a piece of this glory too.
Like the biggest thing you can become, right? Like as a man,
if you obeyed if you listened to the propaganda and you believed it, then yes.
But
Becoming a soldier for the French army was the best thing you could do for your country.
How about you decline?
If you declined and you weren't drafted, then no big deal. You just continue living out your life. Although your neighbors might think you're a coward.
I can live with that. That's worse.
Well, I mean, the same thing happened to the United States during both world wars. So people would, come up to others, military-age men, and be like, "What branch of the service are you in, son?" Be like, "Oh, I haven't joined up." "Oh, what? Are you some coward?"
Yep.
Well, that was a tactic.
Yep, in both world wars. The Grand Army reached and sacked the city of Moscow. But Napoleon could not catch the Tsar or decisively defeat the Tsar's army. Russian forces were really good at shadowing Napoleon's army, harassing his flanks, but rarely engaging him in battle. The only time that the Russian army actually engaged Napoleon was kind of like a last-ditch effort to save Moscow. This is the painting of that battle. It's called the Battle of Borodino. Borodino was a bloodbath. It is... For a while, it has the record of the bloodiest day in military history, but it is the bloodiest day of the Napoleonic Wars. The Russian general in charge of the army was a guy named Kutuzov, and General Kutuzov attacked Napoleon to try to decisively defeat him at the town of Borodino. 70,000 men were killed or wounded in the span of like 12 hours. Kutuzov lost half of his army. If you were a French soldier that was wounded at Borodino, you did not make it back to France because of supply shortages. You died later on. The Russians used scorched earth tactics to deny French troops food and shelter, especially during the winter. The Russians would later do the same thing to the Germans in World War II. Anything that can be used by the invading army, the Russians destroyed it. Kutuzov was not able to defeat Napoleon. Napoleon continued his advance on Moscow, reached the city, and found that it had already been abandoned by the royal family and burned down. And Napoleon's field marshals were like, "Emperor, we have to go. The winter's coming. You can come back next year and finish the Tsar." And Napoleon's like, "No, I've defeated his army. I've taken his capital. He has to sue for peace. He has to." And they sat in Moscow for weeks. And it got colder and colder and colder. And his generals, Emperor, we've got to go. It's getting cold. Napoleon's like, wait just a little bit longer. The Tsar's going to come crawling to me begging for peace terms. And I will be able to enjoy this victory on our march back to Paris. And then the snow started falling. And Napoleon's like, shit, we got to go. The Russians call their winter General Winter, because it is still, even in modern day, the most effective weapon their army has. The temperatures fell to minus 35. This is in 1812. There are no heating blankets, there's no gasoline. Yeah.
Just some fur. Just some fur.
Just some fur. Legend states, and there are stories that came from the soldiers that survived this retreat, that it was so cold that the horses that didn't die, there were soldiers that would come up to the horses and cut pieces of it off because they were so starving so much, and they would cut pieces of the horse off, like off the flank, off the rear quarter, and eat it, and the horse wouldn't even know it was being cut off because it was so numb from the cold. Napoleon went into Russia with 600,000 men. He came back to France with 40,000. Everybody else died. 540,000 men were killed.
So why would you do something like this? Why would you go, you know you'd be killed and you still let it go?
Well, because Napoleon, being a little bit of an egomaniac, he didn't get out when he had the chance. His generals were telling him, as soon as they got to Moscow, hey, this is a bust. You know, we're not going to catch the Tsar. We'll have to try again next year. Let's get the fuck out of here before it gets too cold. And Napoleon's like, no, he has to surrender. And he just didn't listen.
Times that he'd expect every time to win.
Because he had a God complex. He had never been defeated. He expected that he was going to win. After Napoleon's Russian defeat, everybody in Europe rebelled against France. They saw that, just like sharks with blood in the water, they saw that Napoleon was at his weakest. Napoleon, to his credit, was able to raise another army of 400,000 men. He went back to the drawing board, went back to more families of France. We need your sons. Yes, 500,000 of your sons are dead, but I need more sons to defend the fatherland, or the motherland, whatever the French call it. And people were starting to get a little tired of this. But he still put together an army of 400,000 men, but Napoleon was at a significant disadvantage this time because those men were all raw recruits, and Napoleon didn't have the time to really train them to be as fanatical as his previous armies when the war really came crashing down on his head. Now, despite this, Napoleon did win a few spectacular victories in the War of the Sixth Coalition. For example, a series of battles called the Six-Day Campaign. Napoleon had an army of 70,000 men, and he took on an army of 500,000 Prussians and beat them. But the writing was on the wall. The numbers were too great, and Napoleon was at too much of a disadvantage. Napoleon, realizing that he was faced with imminent defeat, tried to kill himself rather than go into exile, and believing that he was a god, not really, but having this god complex, Napoleon took a dose of poison 10 times the strength of a lethal dose, believing that would be required to kill such a powerful man. Well, the thing is, he swallows the poison and his stomach rejects it immediately and he throws it all up.
Right. So that made him think that he was really a god because he couldn't even take the poison.
Yeah, exactly. He was violently ill because he tried. Because he didn't throw all of it up. And what remained in his stomach was enough to make him horrifically sick, but not kill him. He actually called his doctor in and said, give me another dose and finish me. And the doctor says, I'm a doctor, I'm not an assassin. And he storms out.
Wow.
So Napoleon, decided on, April 6th, 1814. He abdicated the throne and went into exile on the island of Elba, which is off the coast of Italy. Louis XVIII, the younger brother of Louis XVI, was placed on the throne of France, and Napoleon spent 9 months in exile. During those 9 months, he plotted his return. And there were plenty of opportunities for it, because all of the coalition forces that had defeated Napoleonic France were now squabbling over the spoils of war. On top of that, all of the French soldiers that had been taken prisoner by the Spanish, by the Russians, whatever, they had all been released and sent back to France. So Napoleon's like, if I can get back into France, I will have an army of loyal and experienced and trained soldiers. I just have to assemble them. And the French citizens hated being under a king again. So they were getting a little tired of Napoleon because of the bloodshed of the wars. But when the king comes back, like, hey, look, it's the House of Bourbon. Everybody in France is like, God damn it. And the House of Bourbon didn't learn its lesson. So Louis XVIII comes in, he's like, these people had my brother beheaded, so I'm just going to do to them everything that my brother did to them, and they will love me for it. So he didn't learn his lesson. After 9 months of exile, Napoleon smuggled himself back into France. Louis XVIII panicked. He sent a battalion to try to arrest Napoleon, but when those men found him, they proclaimed him emperor and marched him back to Paris as a hero, and Louis bolted. Napoleon then promised that he was going to pursue a peaceful foreign policy, and nobody in Europe believed him. They assembled a 7th coalition and they attacked him. Napoleon was outnumbered. He had 200,000 men against 850,000. Napoleon tried to win a battle of Waterloo, because Napoleon's like, well, I'm just going to do to the 7th coalition what I did to them at Austerlitz, so I'm going to chop them up piece by piece before they can assemble a united army. And he attacked a combined Prussian and British force at Waterloo, and came within a whisker of winning that battle, but ended up being defeated. He ran out of time. One of the contributing factors for Napoleon losing at Waterloo is he had hemorrhoids. Napoleon was really good at improvisation. But in order to improvise, you have to be able to see the entire battlefield.
Yeah.
So Napoleon, when he was in his prime, would ride his horse all up and down the battlefield all day. Or he'd sit up on a hill and then send messages out. And if his horse got tired, he'd just swap it out for another horse. But at Waterloo, his hemorrhoids were so bad, it hurt to ride a horse. So he had to rely on his field marshals, who were very good, by the way. But field marshals only control a very specific section of the battlefield. So they wouldn't be able to coordinate with each other in large ways. So Napoleon, can't ride to one side of the battlefield to like Field Marshal Neymar and say, I need you to send 5,000 men over to the western flank. He wasn't able to do that. So the battle plan got kind of thrown out the window and the French couldn't win. Napoleon ended up going into exile on the island of St. Helena, where he died of stomach cancer in 1821. This is a painting of him on, going into his exile. This is the last portrait that was painted by painted of Napoleon. You can kind of tell from his body language that he was a broken man.
You said stomach cancer?
Stomach cancer killed him. Okay. So in terms of post-Napoleonic Europe, what do you do with it? So the lion was gone, Napoleon was gone, Louis XVIII was back on the throne. The victorious powers restored the Bourbon monarchy, and the monarchies of Europe began kind of undoing all of the reforms that they had done in the first place to defeat Napoleon. So the meritocracies were dismantled and replaced with the old traditional order. Censorship was put back into place. Legal rights began to be stripped away. It's no surprise that 30, 40 years later, there was another wave of rebellions throughout Europe, all trying to overthrow the monarchies, because the monarchies didn't learn the lesson from the French Revolution. The French Revolution showed the French monarchies that the people of Europe weren't going to take it anymore. I mean, the Americans had shown that it was possible. And then the French showed that it was also possible. And then everybody else in Europe is like, oh no, hopefully our people weren't paying attention. Prussia and Austria gained territory at the expense of France. The monarchies of Europe also began to coordinate with each other. We'll talk about this in a future class. It's called the Congress of Vienna. Basically, all the monarchies began supporting each other rather than be rivals. So after the French Revolution, all the monarchies were like, well, if we don't keep control over Europe, then we could lose our heads. So instead of these rivalries that we've had over the last couple of centuries, let's agree to be friends, and instead of seeing each other as the enemies, we'll see our people as the enemies. And the monarchies began coordinating in order to suppress liberal ideas from the Enlightenment. Now, another side effect of Napoleon is because of the cooperation with the monarchs to really screw over their people, Europe was spared another major war for about 100 years, because all of the governments of Europe were at least on the same side. So after Napoleon was defeated in 1815, there would not be another major European war until World War I broke out in 1914, 99 years later. But we'll talk about that in a future class. Now, as for the impact of the revolutions in the colonies, I'm going to try to get this done quickly so that I can get you out of here on time. And talk about the impact of the French Revolution on Haiti, Saint-Domingue. Saint-Domingue provided a third of France's foreign trade. Sugar, coffee, cotton, all of it came out of what is the island, what is now the island of Haiti. But Saint-Domingue is, Haiti and Dominican Republic. The population breakdown of the French colony, there were 40,000 free whites, 28,000 gens de couleur, which literally translates to people of color, and about 500,000 slaves. Slave mortality in Haiti was astronomical. The conditions in Haiti were horrific. We're talking hell on earth. The conditions on the sugar plantations of Saint-Domingue were worse than anything you would ever find in the pre-Civil War South. They were awful. And that's because there was such a huge discrepancy between the slave population and the free population. The free population terrorized the slaves because they were so paranoid about a slave uprising. Slave owners were living in constant fear of a slave rebellion. But the American Revolution kind of got the genie out of the bottle. And once you get the genie out of the bottle, you can't put it back in. 500 gens de couleur volunteered to fight for the American Continental Army. So they went to the colonies in order to fight the British. And while they're there, what are they hearing? Thomas Jefferson, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. These are mulattoes. These are mixed-race people that are treated like second-class citizens in Saint-Domingue. So they return after the revolution's over, and they've embraced the concepts of the American Revolution. That people are equal, that people should govern themselves, that independence is great, that individual liberties are great, that kind of thing. So when the French Revolution broke out in 1789, the whites saw an opportunity for them to establish rule over an island of themselves and turn Haiti into their own little private country. Well, the gens de couleur came up and they're like, well, what about us? We're free citizens. We can make this work. And the free white population was like, no, you're second-class citizens. We're not giving you any privileges in our new country. So a civil war broke out in Haiti in 1791. And while the militias of the gens de couleur and the militias of the free whites were hammering each other, who was watching the slaves?
No one.
So the slaves rebelled. By August of 1791, there were 12,000 slaves in rebellion. Within a few weeks, those 12,000 slaves became 100,000 slaves. And Haiti broke into a three-way civil war between the free whites, the free mixed race, and the slaves, the rebelling slaves. The National Assembly dispatched troops in 1792 to restore order, and then a year later, the British and the Spanish sent troops there trying to take advantage. So it's a three-way civil war, and now you've got three foreign powers. Well, technically, you can take the French out of that, but now you have two foreign powers that are also messing around. So now it's a five-way war.
What do you know who to kill?
I know, right? Well, it's real easy for the slaves. Kill anybody that's not a slave. During this chaos, a man named François-Dominique Toussaint, we know him as Toussaint Louverture, gained leadership of the slave rebellion and began organizing an effective resistance that capitalized on this chaos of war. Toussaint Louverture was actually one of the very few literate slaves in Saint-Domingue. He was freed in 1776. His former master taught him how to read and write. And when the rebellion started, he actually helped smuggle his former master and his family out of the country. So, take whatever conclusion you want out of that. But because he was literate, he very quickly rose to the ranks of the slave rebellion. Because he could read and write. And he also read books on how to be a soldier and that kind of thing. So he knew how to fight, he knew how to organize. He taught himself how to be a general. Guy was very smart. In 1793, Louverture turned the slaves from just a band of rebels into a functioning army. A trained and disciplined army. They marched in formation. They had uniforms. They did battle drill. He learned it all just by reading books. In 1797, Louverture's army numbered 20,000 men. For an island the size of Saint-Domingue, that's a big army. In 1801, Louverture's government wrote a constitution which granted freedom and equality. Independence, however, was not declared in 1801 because Louverture was afraid that he would provoke Napoleon. And Napoleon in 1801 was on the upswing. Regardless, though, Napoleon sent 40,000 troops to quell the uprising. Louverture did attempt to negotiate a peaceful settlement but the delegates that he met with were not operating in good faith, so he shows up hoping to negotiate. They throw him in chains, put him on a ship, and send him to France, where he ended up dying of malnutrition in France. They let him starve to death. However, the French got their comeuppance shortly after Louverture was captured and sent to France, because yellow fever broke out among the French troops and decimated the army. And then Louverture's successors defeated what was left of it. On January 1st, 1804, Saint-Domingue declared independence as Haiti, the second independent republic in the Western Hemisphere, and to date, the only successful slave uprising in history.
Wow.
Now, in order to restore order, Louverture is gone. He's dead. So his second in command, a guy named Jean-Jacques Dessalines, took over. Dessalines was Louverture's number 2. And he was the one that defeated the French army. Now, he won the decisive battle that secured independence. When Haiti declared independence, Dessalines declared himself Emperor Jacques I, trying to make himself a smaller version of Napoleon. He ruled from 1804 until 1806. He ended up being assassinated by members of his own government. This is what separated Dessalines from Louverture. Louverture was a house slave. Dessalines was a field hand. They received far different treatment in Haiti, and Dessalines had a bit of a mean streak in him because he was angry, because he was very poorly treated. Now, under Dessalines' rule, despite him proclaiming a republic, he was effectively a dictator. All black men in Haiti were required to either, they didn't have a choice in this, they could either join the army or they could work in the fields. That was it. Secure the state by working in the military for its defense, or secure the economy of the state by working in the fields. And the conditions under the rule of Dessalines really weren't that much different from the conditions under the French. And a lot of his followers began speaking out loud that they had been enslaved again by their own people. And that's what led to his assassination. Dessalines' policy was actually a continuation of Louverture, because Louverture started doing this before he was captured because he was fighting a war. All whites were forbidden from owning property and land, and in 1804, Dessalines ordered the mass murder of the remaining white population in Haiti, including the whites that sided with Louverture.
Wow.
Those who were...
This is the only time I've heard in history that they gave the whites and the black.
What's up?
And this is the only time in history that I've heard that they're giving the whites and the black.
It's kind of like, yeah, I see your point. But yeah, it's kind of like the situation like, okay, when I look at the Haitian Rebellion, you kind of got to think, especially for the French population that remained in Haiti, it's like you've treated these people like dogs for generations. Don't you think there's going to be a little bit of a backlash?
Of course.
Yeah. The reason I'm even bringing this up in the first place is because the impact of this is why Haiti is still treated the way it is in the modern global geopolitical situation. So, like, right after Haiti declared independence in 1804, the U.S. kind of reached out a hand of friendship, very, very briefly. But then when the killing started, the U.S. is like, oh, never mind. And I'm also bringing this up because this would have a dramatic impact on American history as well, which I think is something else you need to know. So the Haitian massacre of 1804 is a bona fide ethnic cleansing. About 3,000 or 4,000, actually between 3,000 and 5,000 people were killed between January and April of 1804. Women, children, men, it didn't matter. Now, to the credit of the soldiers that were obeying Dessalines' orders, they did not want to kill women and children. Because a lot of these guys are like, I'm a soldier, I'm not a murderer. But Dessalines had a group of real hardcore fanatics that ended up carrying out that killing, and Dessalines justified it by saying, French women produce French men. Kill the women so they don't have any more kids. Dessalines then also ordered an invasion of the Spanish-held side of the island, which became the Dominican Republic, because a lot of the French that were living in Haiti fled to that side of the island, and Dessalines hunted them down. This, by the way, is why the Dominican Republic and Haiti don't get along very well. Because while the Haitian military was in there, they did a lot of indiscriminate killing, including of the natives and the Spaniards. Now, propaganda, obviously being what it is, exasperated this killing. These were actually published in American newspapers. So you can kind of understand the backlash given the centuries of abuses toward the black population, but I mean, come on, ethnic cleansing is ethnic cleansing. You're never going to be able to excuse it. The survivors of the massacres, however, did escape to the southern United States. They went to New Orleans, they went to Charlestown, some of them ended up in New York City. And when they got to the United States, they brought horror stories of what they saw with a little bit of embellishment and a little bit of propaganda. Now they go in the South, where slavery is still practiced, or where slavery was still practiced in the US, and they're telling the horror stories of the slaves got free and then started killing the whites. What do you think the Southerners are going to think? There was a budding abolition movement, very small abolition movement, but promising in the southern United States shortly after independence. When the survivors of the Haitian massacres made it into the South, that killed that abolition movement dead in its tracks. So Southern lawmakers, fearing another Haitian-style genocide, resisted any calls for emancipation following this. And the killings led to a negative international view of the Haitian Revolution, contributing to the ongoing racial hostility in Haitian society. And then the French government stepped in and demanded payment for all destruction of French property during the Revolution, which the Haitian government finally paid off only a couple of years ago. And because they've been paying this ransom to the French government, their economy is practically non-existent. They don't have any money because they've been paying it all to the French. All right, I'm going to try to get through the Mexican and Venezuelan revolutions. It should only take 5 or 6 minutes. It shouldn't take too long. All right, so Mexico. The Mexican Revolution was responsible for these two guys. Miguel Hidalgo y Castilla and Agustin Iturbide. He was Creole. He was mestizo, was a priest. The common theme of all the revolutions in Latin America have everything to do when Napoleon stepped in and placed his brother Joseph on the throne of Spain. Because the Spanish colonies were being ruled by Peninsulares that were being sent by the Spanish government. Well, the Spanish crown was gone and replaced by a Frenchman. And the Peninsulares weren't happy about this. So they stopped going to the colonies because no one was sending them. And the Creoles in the colonies were like, well, this is the opportunity for us to govern our own country. Because remember a couple weeks ago we talked about the social hierarchy of the Spanish system and how Peninsulares were at the top and the Creoles were under them? Creoles, despite being pure-blood Spaniards, they were still considered second class in Spanish society. And they hated being under the rule of the Peninsulares. So when the Peninsulares lost control, when the Spanish government lost control of the colonies, the Creoles were like, this is our chance to rule our own country. But then again, going back to that Spanish social hierarchy, who's below the Creoles? The mestizo. So the Creoles come in, we want to be the new nobility, and we're going to keep the mestizo as second-class citizens. You can see how this is going to play out. So by 1810, there were rebellions in Mexico, Argentina, Venezuela. They were all orchestrated by the Creoles. In Mexico, it was started by this man. It was a peasant uprising. Costilla originally did get some support from some Creoles, but being a mestizo, he started calling for the deaths of all Spaniards. And the Creoles were like, hold up.
He's a priest.
Hmm?
He's a priest, right?
Yeah. And he started calling for the deaths of Creoles as well. And the Creoles were like, oh, okay, never mind. So the Creoles had him killed. And the revolution fell under the control of this man, Agustin Iturbide. To date, the beginning of Castillo's rebellion marks Mexican Independence Day, September 16th, 1810. And then Iturbide took over the revolution, kicked the Peninsulares out, and by 1821 declared independence. The Mexican Republic officially formed in 1824. It had some fluctuations with its borders for a couple of years. At one point in time, the Mexican Republic actually controlled quite a bit of Central America. What is now Guatemala, for example, was originally under Mexican authority. But, I mean, it expanded and it contracted, and then after a couple of years, it solidified. In terms of Venezuela, the man that led that was this man, Simón Bolívar, who was also a Creole and a general. He had a military pedigree. There's a statue of him in Central Park, by the way, if you're interested. He's the guy on the horse that you see on 50th, I think? I can't remember.
Why do they have a statue of him in the Dominican Republic?
Hmm?
Why do they have a statue of him in the Dominican Republic?
He's pretty important for a lot of areas in that area. He actually tried to create a United States of South America. He was going to call it Gran Colombia. And a lot of countries were supposed to be part of it. And he actually thought he was a failure because Gran Colombia fell apart. And it broke his heart. And he ended up going into a self-imposed exile. Because all he was able to see was the failure of his grand dream. But in reality, he also led to the independence of Venezuela and Chile and Peru and Bolivia and all these other countries gained their independence because of him. And he didn't recognize it because all he saw was that his grand plan fell apart. And it broke his heart.
He was like an important figure in the
What was that?
He's like an important figure in like South America.
Huge figure in South America because he's the one that kicked the Peninsulars out. And he was campaigning all over the place. So his rebellion started in 1811. He was inspired by George Washington. He read Locke and Hobbes and Rousseau. I mean, he was definitely inspired by the Enlightenment. Gran Colombia formed and then crumbled by 1830, and he ended up going into a self-imposed exile. He was on a ship on his way to Europe when he died of tuberculosis in, I think, 1832, something like that. He, in like a moment of despair, he declared South America to be ungovernable. Now, the legacy of the revolution, and this is, I swear my last thing. Shortly after winning independence, and this is why Bolivar is also looked at as a good figure, because he wasn't really in place, or he wasn't around for the chaos that followed. So for Latin America, Bolivar is a hero, because he had no part in the chaos that came after independence. So people in Latin America see Bolivar as a guy that liberated Latin America. And then when the violence kicked in and Latin America kind of tore itself apart, fighting over resources and borders, Bolivar was already out of the picture. So he was not tainted by that. That would be like, for example, if George Washington was still alive when the Civil War broke out. Like, his reputation would be tarnished. And Bolivar died before his reputation could be tarnished. Okay, so shortly after winning independence, Latin American countries suffered decades of war and internal conflict, mostly over resources and borders. Like one, for example, there was one called the Paraguayan War. Anybody ever hear of that? It's also known as the War of the Triple Alliance. It was fought from 1864 to 1870. It was caused by a border dispute, a really stupid border dispute that could have been solved through diplomacy. But Paraguay ended up going to war against an alliance of Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay. A war they could not win. And the dictator that was in charge of Paraguay ended up getting 70% of his male population killed. Paraguay was almost completely wiped out. 70% of their men were killed in the war. I've seen estimates as high as 90% of Paraguayan men were killed. 400,000 people in total. It is the bloodiest war in Latin American history. By the way, Brazil still has Paraguay's historical documents. Because the war started in 1864. The capital of Paraguay fell into Brazilian control a couple of years later. And all of the national records were seized by the Brazilians. And it's being kept in a vault somewhere in Brazil. And Paraguay, reaches out every now and then. They petition through the UN, can we have our records back? And Brazil's like, no, because you have to learn your lesson. Yeah, it's insane. It's really bad. But the civil unrest that was happening in Latin America had everything to do with the mestizo and the Creole tensions. Because people like Bolivar, and people like Iturbide, they came in, they fight for independence of their countries, but then who's going to rule the new country? The Creoles wanted to be on top. The mestizos wanted to be equal. And that's why they fought. Okay.